Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most forbidden mysteries, hit that hype button and let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you want to see more of. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're wide awake at noon or drifting off at 3 a.m. halfway across the globe. Your comments make this community what it is. And a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. This one's going to take us somewhere we've never been before. Now, let's talk about the Anunnaki. The discovery. Every civilization tells the same story. Gods came from the sky, created mankind, and vanished. In the spring of 2024, an archaeologist named Daniel Reeves found something buried beneath that story, and it nearly destroyed him. Picture this: a research dig outside Eridu, Iraq, the world's first recorded city. The desert stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by ancient mounds that hide the foundations of humanity's earliest experiments with civilization. The heat's oppressive, the kind that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. Dust devils spin across the landscape, and the horizon shimmers with mirages that look like water but promise only more sand. Reeves was part of a small, privately funded team excavating a Sumerian temple foundation. The funding came from a tech entrepreneur fascinated by ancient history, the kind of money that let them work without the usual constraints of academic bureaucracy or government oversight. Just 6 people, Reeves as lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students named Tom Chen and Lisa Okafor, a site surveyor named James Whitmore, a translator named Amira Hassan, who specialised in ancient Sumerian, and a documentary filmmaker named Kevin Park, who was supposed to be capturing the dig for a future series about archaeological discoveries. The work was methodical, painstaking, the kind of thing that usually yields pottery shards and temple receipts, the mundane paperwork of ancient bureaucracy. They'd been at it for 6 weeks, mapping the temple foundation, cataloguing fragments of clay tablets, photographing everything in meticulous detail. Standard archaeology, the kind that builds careers slowly and carefully. But on a Tuesday morning in late March, everything changed. They were excavating what should have been a storage room on the eastern side of the temple complex. Lisa was working with a brush and small hand tools, carefully removing sediment that had accumulated over 45 centuries. She hit something solid, heard the scrape of metal on stone. Not unusual, plenty of stones in ancient foundations. But this stone was different. It was too smooth, too regular. She called Reeves over. He knelt beside her, examined the surface she had exposed. It was limestone, but worked with a precision that seemed unusual for the period. The surface had been ground flat, polished to a mirror smoothness that would have required significant effort and sophisticated technique. And there were marks on it, shallow grooves that might have been decorative or might have been something else. "Keep going," Reeves said. "Let's see what we have." 3 hours later, they'd exposed a stone slab nearly 2 meters on each side, set flush into the floor. The grooves formed a pattern, geometric and deliberate, spiralling from the edges toward the center where a circular depression suggested some kind of mechanism or seal. Amira examined the grooves carefully, running her fingers along them, feeling the depth and spacing. "These aren't decorative," she said. "They're inscriptions, but I don't recognize the script. It's older than standard cuneiform, more pictographic. Proto-writing, maybe, or something else entirely." Tom set up the ground-penetrating radar while Lisa and Kevin documented everything with photographs and video. The GPR results came back showing a void beneath the stone slab, a chamber roughly 4 meters deep and extending 6 meters in each direction. "We need to open it," Reeves said. Nobody argued. They worked for 2 days, carefully prying up the stone slab with jacks and leverage, afraid of damaging whatever was beneath. When it finally lifted free, the smell hit them first. Not decay or rot, but something else, something metallic and sharp that made their eyes water. The air from the chamber below was different, processed through stone for millennia, sealed away from the world above. James rigged lighting and lowered it into the chamber. The lights came on, and everyone gathered around the opening to look. The chamber was lined with stone blocks, each carved with inscriptions that covered every surface. The writing was dense, layered, some characters carved over others as if someone had run out of space and kept adding more information. But that wasn't what made them all stop and stare in silence. On the far wall, illuminated by their temporary lights, was a massive carving nearly 2 meters tall. 2 figures, humanoid, but not quite human. Their proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms too angular, heads slightly too large. They wore fitted garments that looked more like flight suits than ancient robes, covered in geometric patterns that might have been decorative or might have been functional. And they were holding tablets, not clay tablets. These tablets glowed in the carving, represented with a luminescence that had been achieved by inlaying the stone with some kind of crystalline material that caught the light and scattered it. The tablets were covered in grid patterns, regular arrangements of squares that looked less like writing and more like circuit boards, like technology rendered in stone by people who shouldn't have had any concept of such things. "Get down there," Reeves told Tom and Kevin. "Document everything. Every angle, every inscription, everything." They spent the next 3 days in that chamber. The inscriptions covered not just the walls but the floor and ceiling, a complete enclosure of information. Amira worked herself to exhaustion trying to translate, filling notebooks with sketches and notes, consulting references on her laptop, comparing characters to known Sumerian texts. The dating came back from samples they'd carefully extracted. 4,500 years before the Common Era, give or take a century. That would make it contemporary with the very founding of Sumerian civilization, possibly even earlier. Contemporary with the moment when humans supposedly first figured out writing and agriculture and organised religion. But the inscriptions didn't read like early writing. They read like something mature, developed, technical. Then came the pigment analysis. The crystalline material inlaid in the carved tablets contained trace amounts of iridium, a metal rarely found on Earth's surface. Iridium comes from space, from meteor impacts, or from deep in the planet's core where it sank billions of years ago when the Earth was molten. You don't find it in surface deposits. You don't mine it with ancient technology. You don't accidentally incorporate it into artwork, unless someone brought it from somewhere else. Reeves documented everything methodically. He took hundreds of photographs from every angle, collected samples of the stone and the inlay material, filled 3 hard drives with video footage and data files. His field notes, later leaked through a series of encrypted emails to contacts at the British Museum, contained observations that read less like archaeology and more like science fiction. One entry, dated March 28th, 2024. The inscriptions refer to the design of life, not as a gift, but as a project. They mention something called the model of the clay, which reads like an instruction manual for genetic creation. The figures aren't gods receiving worship. They're scientists documenting an experiment. Another entry, March 30th. Translation of Chamber Wall, Section 4. The pattern was set into the clay, ratio 7:3, aligned with the breath sequence. 23 pairs achieved stability. The creation walked and spoke and remembered instruction. This isn't poetry. It's a procedure. 23 pairs. The human genome contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. Nobody in 4500 BCE should have known that. Nobody should have even understood what chromosomes were, let alone how to count them. The breath sequence. DNA requires specific base pair sequences to function, patterns that repeat in rhythms, instructions written in chemical notation that wouldn't be discovered for another 5,000 years. The creation walked and spoke and remembered. higher cognitive function, language capability, memory formation, the defining characteristics of human consciousness, described in clinical terms by people who shouldn't have had the framework to think in those terms. Kevin captured all of it on video. Hours of footage, wide shots and close-ups, Amira translating in real time, Reeves examining the inscriptions with increasingly frantic energy as he realised what they might be looking at. That was the last official transmission from the dig site. On April 2nd, 2024, Reeves uploaded his field notes to an encrypted cloud server and sent copies to 3 colleagues he trusted. On April 3rd, he tried to contact the British Museum to arrange a consultation with their Sumerian experts. On April 4th, the dig site was shut down. After that, just static. Act 1. The official story. To understand what happened next, we need to understand what the Anunnaki actually are, at least according to the accepted historical record. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology as the pantheon of major gods who shape the world and humanity's place in it. The word itself breaks down in Sumerian. Anu, referring to the sky or heaven, and Kai, meaning earth, with the connecting Na, suggesting descent or origin. They are literally those who from heaven to earth came. There's Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority among the gods, remote and powerful, sitting in judgment over both divine and human affairs. There's Enki, god of wisdom, water and creation, portrayed as the craftsman who shaped humanity, who gave us intelligence and knowledge, who often intervened on behalf of his creations against harsher gods. And there's Enlil, god of air and command, who saw humans as a necessary workforce but little more, who advocated for humanity's destruction when we became too numerous and noisy. These aren't obscure figures mentioned in a single text. Thousands of clay tablets recovered from sites across ancient Mesopotamia mention them, describe their actions, catalogue their relationships and conflicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh references them. The Atrahasis epic describes them in detail. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, places them at the centre of cosmic order. Museums around the world house these artefacts. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, the National Museum of Iraq. Translations exist, peer-reviewed and documented by Assyriologists who've spent entire careers studying these texts. This is established historical fact, at least as much as anything from 5,000 years ago can be called fact. The standard interpretation treats them as mythology, as primitive humans attempt to explain the world through storytelling and supernatural agency. Ancient people didn't understand natural phenomena, didn't know about weather patterns or geological processes or biological evolution, so they invented gods to explain what they saw. The Anunnaki were powerful beings who controlled things humans couldn't control, who provided order and meaning to an otherwise chaotic existence. Standard mythology, right? The kind of creation story every ancient culture has. Gods make humans, humans worship gods, everyone knows their place. The Sumerians weren't special in this regard. Every civilization from the Greeks to the Maya to the Norse had pantheons of powerful beings who created the world and shaped human destiny. Except the Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about certain details. They describe the Anunnaki coming to Earth with specific purposes, mining operations in southern Africa according to some texts, agricultural development in Mesopotamia according to others. They needed workers for their projects, labour that could perform complex tasks but remain under control, so they created humans. The Sumerian term is Adamu, the first man, created to serve, but the creation process is described with unusual precision. Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, took the clay of the earth and mixed it with the essence of the gods, combining earthly matter with divine substance in specific ratios to create something new. One text describes it this way: "In the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul which in a god have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound. Clay and blood, earth and essence, physical matter and genetic information, instructions for creating life by combining existing biological material with new patterns, new code. And here's where Daniel Reeves's field notes started to sound less like fanciful interpretation and more like genuine alarm, because the inscriptions in that sealed chamber described the same process, but in language that read less like mythology and more like technical documentation. One section, laboriously translated by Amira Hassan over 3 exhausting days. The clay was refined through 7 passes, removing impurities, establishing baseline compatibility. The essence was introduced in measured proportion, 7 parts clay to 3 parts essence. The ratio determined through prior testing on lesser forms. 23 binding pairs were established, each pair encoding specific function, structure, cognition, reproduction, lifespan regulation, sensory input processing, motor control, metabolic efficiency. 7:3 ratio, 23 pairs, specific functions encoded in binding pairs. This wasn't poetry, this wasn't metaphor, this was a procedure, written by someone who understood genetics at a level that shouldn't have been possible for people working in 4500 BCE. Another section described outcomes. Initial trials produced unstable forms, insufficient cognitive capability, shortened lifespan, inadequate reproductive compatibility. Adjustments were made to binding sequences, enhanced neural pathways, extended telomere structures, improved protein synthesis efficiency. Final form achieved stability after 47 iterations. 47 iterations. Trial and error. Scientific method. Someone was refining a process, learning from failures, improving results through systematic experimentation. The standard interpretation of Anunnaki mythology involves gods moulding humans from clay, like a sculptor working with raw material. But Reeves had found something that suggested those ancient myths were preserving memory of something real, something that actually happened. Not spiritual creation, but biological engineering. Not divine magic, but applied science by beings who understood genetics and molecular biology in ways that humans wouldn't rediscover for thousands of years, and someone noticed that he'd found it. Aced 2. The cover-up. Within 72 hours of Reeves's last field note upload, the excavation was shut down. The sequence of events moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested someone had been monitoring the dig closely and was ready to act the moment something specific was discovered. April 4th, 9:30 in the morning local time. 2 vehicles arrived at the dig site, one from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, one from a private American contractor called Archon Geosolutions. 6 men total, carrying documents, and wearing professional business clothes completely inappropriate for the desert heat. The man from the Department of Antiquities, whose name was listed as Hakim Rashid in the documents, but whose actual identity remained unclear, informed Reeves that the excavation was being shut down immediately. The stated reasons: site contamination from improper handling of artifacts, excavation beyond permitted boundaries, failure to properly document chain of custody for samples removed from the site, and concerns about damage to culturally significant materials. Reeves tried to argue. He showed them the documentation and the photographs, the meticulous records they'd kept. He explained that they'd followed every protocol, exceeded every standard for archaeological preservation, done everything by the book and then some. Rashid was unmoved. The decision had been made at higher levels, he explained. There was nothing he could do. The site would be sealed pending further investigation. The men from Archon Geosolutions said nothing. They just stood there in their business. Casual clothes and reflective sunglasses, watching, waiting for the conversation to end so they could begin their work. "What's Archon's involvement?" Reeves asked. "This is an archaeological site under Iraqi jurisdiction. Why is a private American contractor here? Rashid's face tightened slightly. Archon has a contract with the Ministry to provide technical assessment and remediation services for sites that may present environmental or safety concerns. Their involvement is routine and appropriate. It wasn't routine, it wasn't appropriate. American contractors don't show up within hours of a discovery unless they were already close, already watching, already prepared to intervene. Within 6 hours, Archon had cordoned off the entire excavation area with security fencing and warning signs. They brought in equipment, sophisticated gear that looked more like military tech than archaeological tools, ground-penetrating radar arrays, electromagnetic scanning equipment, atmospheric sampling devices, all set up with practiced efficiency by technicians who clearly did this regularly. The team wasn't allowed back to the site. They watched from a distance as the chamber they'd discovered was accessed by Archon personnel, wearing full environmental suits, the kind you'd use for hazardous materials or biological containment. Everything they'd found, samples, hard drives, notebooks, equipment, was confiscated as evidence in the ongoing investigation. Reeves managed to keep his laptop and one backup drive that he'd hidden in his tent. Everything else was gone. By April 7th, the entire team was in Baghdad being processed for departure. Their visas were suddenly found to have administrative irregularities. Their permits were under review pending investigation into the violations at the site. They needed to return to their countries of origin immediately and await further instructions. Tom Chen, Lisa Okafor and James Whitmore took the hint. They flew home, understanding that arguing would only make things worse for their careers. Kevin Park went back to South Korea, his footage and equipment confiscated, his documentary dead before it started. Amira Hassan, being Iraqi, stayed in Baghdad but was told in no uncertain terms that discussing the excavation publicly would result in consequences for both her and her family. She went quiet. Only Daniel Reeves refused to let it go. Back in London, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He had his backup drive with copies of most of the photographs and his field notes, enough to remember what they'd found, even if he couldn't prove it anymore. He reached out to colleagues, tried to piece together who had the power to shut down an excavation that quickly and thoroughly. Most people told him to let it go. He'd screwed up the politics somehow, probably by not properly coordinating with Iraqi authorities before going too deep. Or maybe the funding source was problematic. Maybe the tech entrepreneur who'd backed them had enemies who wanted to cause trouble. Or maybe, most likely, he'd simply gotten unlucky and stumbled into some bureaucratic turf war between Iraqi agencies. Just drop it, they said. Take the loss, learn from it, move on to the next project. Academia was full of dead ends and political complications. This wasn't unusual. This was just how things went sometimes. But one person listened. Rachel Monroe was an investigative journalist who specialised in the shadowy spaces where government secrecy, military operations and private contractors overlapped. She'd covered the looting of the Iraqi National Museum after the 2003 invasion, had traced stolen artefacts through black markets from Baghdad to London to New York. She'd exposed private military companies running protection rackets at archaeological sites, documented the systematic destruction of cultural heritage under the cover of conflict. When Reeves contacted her through an encrypted messaging app, she was sceptical. Another archaeologist angry about losing funding, probably. Another academic with a conspiracy theory about governments hiding history. She'd heard it all before, the stories about suppressed evidence and secret knowledge. Almost always nonsense. Then Reeves showed her the iridium analysis. He showed her the photographs of inscriptions that described genetics in a way that shouldn't have been possible in 4500 BCE. He showed her the carbon dating results, and the pigment composition reports, and the translation notes that read like laboratory procedures. Monroe's skepticism turned into curiosity. She started asking questions, making calls, digging through databases and public records, looking for information about Archon Geo solutions. What she found was a maze of shell companies and classification barriers, but the outline was clear enough to be troubling. Archon Geosolutions was, on paper, a geological surveying and environmental consulting firm based in McLean, Virginia. They had contracts throughout the Middle East, concentrated heavily in Iraq, doing site assessments for construction projects and infrastructure development. Their website showed smiling engineers in hard hats, satellite imagery of terrain analysis, corporate language about safety and efficiency and cutting-edge technology. Standard corporate work, nothing suspicious on the surface. But Monroe had her sources in the intelligence community, people who leaked when they felt the public deserved to know what was happening in their name. She started asking about Archon specifically, about their work in Iraq, about what they were really doing under the cover of geological surveys. One source, a former contractor who'd worked in Baghdad and gotten disillusioned with the whole operation, gave her enough to start tracing the money. Archon's primary funding didn't come from construction companies or infrastructure projects. It came through a series of shell companies that eventually led back to a bioinformatics research group with ties to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Pentagon's Science and Technology Development Arm. The research group had been active in Baghdad since 2003, right after the invasion, operating under various cover identities and corporate fronts. Their stated research focus, in the few classified documents Monroe could access through her sources, comparative genomics and non-terrestrial isotopic DNA studies. Non-terrestrial, as in not from Earth. Monroe obtained leaked satellite imagery of the Eridu site, taken before and after the shutdown. Before the shutdown, the excavation showed a typical dig pattern, organised grid squares, careful systematic exposure of the archaeological layers, standard academic work. After the shutdown, thermal imaging revealed extensive underground scanning operations. The equipment signatures matched deep penetration ground mapping systems, the kind used to map subterranean structures without excavation, to find caves and tunnels and voids deep below the surface. Archon wasn't covering up the site. They were exploring it further, going deeper, looking for something else, and they didn't want witnesses. Monroe got one more piece of the puzzle through a source at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Archon had requested and received updated satellite coverage of a specific area around Eridu, continuous monitoring that went far beyond what a simple geological survey would require. The coverage extended for kilometres in all directions, high-resolution thermal and electromagnetic spectrum analysis, updated every 6 hours. They were looking for something specific, some kind of signature or anomaly that required constant monitoring, and whatever it was important enough to justify shutting down an archaeological dig and classifying everything Reeves had found. Someone wasn't trying to hide the past, Monroe said when she and Reeves met in a quiet London pub to compare notes. They were trying to reclaim it. Whatever the Anunnaki left behind, whoever they actually were, someone thinks it's valuable enough to bury under classification and corporate fronts. Reeves looked at the documents spread across the table between them, the shell company connections and satellite imagery and leaked memos. So what do we do? Monroe smiled, the kind of smile that meant she'd already decided to do something dangerous. We find out what else they've found. If Eridu was shut down this quickly, there must be other sites, other discoveries that got buried, a pattern we can trace. She pulled out a map of the Middle East, marked with archaeological sites from Syria to Iran. Let's see where else the gods came from the sky. Act 3. The pattern. Reeves and Monroe spent the next 6 weeks building a database of archaeological discoveries in the Middle East that had been shut down, classified, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The pattern emerged quickly once they knew what to look for. In 1994, a joint Turkish-German team excavating near the ancient city of Harran in southern Turkey uncovered a series of stone tablets with inscriptions that predated known Sumerian writing. The tablets described a gathering place, a garden where the gods instructed the first humans in agriculture, law, and proper worship. The texts were remarkably detailed, describing irrigation techniques that wouldn't be developed until centuries later, astronomical observations that required sophisticated mathematics, medical procedures that suggested anatomical knowledge beyond what primitive cultures should have possessed. The excavation was shut down within 3 weeks. Officially, the closure was due to funding issues and concerns about political instability in the region, since Harran sat near the Syrian border in an area with a history of ethnic tensions. The tablets were transferred to Turkish government archives in Ankara for preservation and further study, but they never appeared in any published research, no peer-reviewed papers, no museum exhibitions. The Turkish government claimed the tablets were too fragile for display, too poorly preserved for reliable translation. A few photographs existed in preliminary reports, but the tablets themselves vanished into climate-controlled storage and were never seen again. Monroe traced the excavation permits and found something interesting. The dig had been partially funded by a grant from an educational foundation based in Switzerland, an organisation that claimed to support international archaeological research and cultural preservation. That foundation received its funding from a consortium of private donors whose identities were protected by Swiss privacy laws. But one of those donors had been careless with their paperwork. A tax filing from 1996 showed a charitable donation to the foundation from a holding company that eventually traced back to the same network that funded Archangeo Solutions. Someone had been paying attention to Harran. Someone had been close enough to shut it down when the tablets were discovered. The Syrian site came next in their research. In 2001, a French archaeological mission working near Tel Brak in northern Syria discovered a chamber beneath an ancient temple, similar to what Reeves had found at Eridu. The chamber contained carved images of figures descending from the sky in vehicles that were described in the field notes as brilliance that moves, craft that shone like stars and moved with purpose rather than drifting like celestial objects. The carvings showed these vehicles opening, figures emerging who were clearly not human despite their generally humanoid shape. The proportions were wrong, the features subtly off, the way they stood and moved captured in stone, in ways that suggested the carvers were working from observation rather than imagination. Local Syrian authorities seized the findings within days, citing concerns about looting and the need to protect culturally significant materials. The chamber was resealed, the site was declared off limits, and the French team was expelled from the country under accusations of attempting to smuggle artefacts. No peer-reviewed paper was ever published. The French team members who worked on the dig had to sign non-disclosure agreements with their own government before they could leave Syria, a highly unusual requirement that suggested pressure from higher levels than just academic archaeology. Monroe found one of those team members, a retired archaeologist named Claude Mercier living in a small village in Brittany. He was willing to talk carefully about what they'd actually found. The vehicles were rendered with technical precision, Mercier explained in French, which Monroe translated as they spoke. Not mythological or symbolic. These were craft with specific features, landing mechanisms, what looked like propulsion systems, and the figures emerging from them were carrying containers, equipment, tools. They weren't gods receiving worship. They were a team arriving to do a job. What kind of job? Monroe asked. Mercier shrugged. The inscriptions around the image described the beginning of instruction. The gods, or whatever they were, teaching humans about agriculture, about building, about organising society. But the language was strange, very clinical. Not the gods blessed humanity with knowledge, but the subjects were educated in necessary procedures. Like a mission report, you understand? Like colonisers documenting their process. Did you take photographs? Of course. Hours of documentation, all confiscated when we were expelled. Mercier paused, looked around his small living room as if checking for listeners, then continued more quietly. But I kept some notes, personal observations that weren't in the official documentation. I can show you those, if you promise to be careful with what you do with them. The notes described in detail what Mercier had seen, observations that hadn't made it into the confiscated official reports. The figures in the carvings wore fitted garments with what looked like functional features, pockets or pouches or equipment attachment points. Their heads were covered with something that looked like protective gear, angular and smooth, with areas that might have been viewing ports or sensors. These weren't gods, Mercier's notes read. These were technicians, specialists, people in equipment designed for a specific environment. Everything about them suggested function over form, purpose over decoration. And the vehicles were even more interesting, with what looked like attitude control thrusters, landing struts, modular components. Whoever carved these images knew what they were looking at because they'd seen it. The Iranian site completed the pattern Munro and Reeves were building. In 2008, an Iranian team working near Susa, the ancient capital of Elam in southwestern Iran, found clay cylinders sealed in a foundation deposit beneath the temple complex. The cylinders contained cuneiform text that, when translated, described the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities who came from a place beyond the sky, whose home was a wandering star that brought them close to Earth in cycles measured in thousands of years. The text described their arrival as a necessity, not a choice. Their home world was dying, or moving away, or becoming uninhabitable. Earth was identified as suitable for their purposes, rich in resources they needed, compatible enough with their biology to allow colonization with appropriate precautions, and humanity. Humanity was described as a solution to a labour shortage. The Anunnaki needed workers for their projects, mining operations or construction or agriculture, tasks that required intelligence and dexterity but not full consciousness or equality. So they created humans by modifying existing primates native to Earth, uplifting them through genetic manipulation to serve specific purposes. The Iranian government classified the findings immediately, invoking cultural heritage protection laws that made the cylinder state secrets. No translation was published. No photographs were released. The team members were told their work had national security implications and that discussing it publicly would result in serious consequences. But one team member, a linguist specialising in ancient Elamite and Akkadian, had fled Iran 3 years later during the political turmoil of the Green Movement. Now, living in Germany under a different name, she was willing to talk to Munro about what she'd translated, though she wouldn't allow her identity to be revealed. The cylinders were very specific about timescales, she explained in careful English. They described the arrival as happening 43 cycles ago, each cycle being the time it took for their homeworld to complete one orbit and return to the inner region where Earth was located. They calculated each cycle as approximately 3,600 Earth years. 43 cycles at 3,600 years each. That's approximately 155,000 years ago. Right around the time modern humans began exhibiting behavioural modernity, when Homo sapiens suddenly started creating art, using symbolic communication, developing complex tools and social structures. The evolutionary leap that anthropologists call the Great Leap Forward, when anatomically modern humans who'd existed for 200,000 years suddenly started acting human, suddenly developed the cognitive capabilities that would lead to civilization. Munro and Reeves looked at the map they'd been building, marked with excavation sites across ancient Mesopotamia, Syria and Turkey. Every site with a suppressed discovery, every location where unusual findings had been classified or confiscated, fell along a specific geographic arc. The arc matched the old Persian descriptions of a place called Din, a land of rivers and fertile plains where the gods first created their garden and began their work with humanity. The Hebrews later adopted the story, translating Din into Eden, the garden at the beginning of the world where God created the first humans. It's not mythology, Reeves said, staring at the map. It's a preserved memory of something that actually happened. The locations are real. The timeline is consistent. Multiple independent. Cultures separated by thousands of years, all describing the same events in the same region. Monroe nodded slowly. If the Anunnaki were real, if they actually came to Earth and genetically engineered humans, then every site along this arc might contain evidence of their work, and someone has been systematically finding that evidence and classifying it for at least 30 years, probably longer. We need to see one of these sites ourselves, Reeves said. We need first-hand evidence that isn't filtered through confiscated reports and leaked documents. Monroe looked at him carefully. That's dangerous. If someone is actively suppressing this information, if governments and private contractors are coordinating to keep it secret, then investigating too openly makes us targets. I know. Reeves pointed to a location on the map in southern Turkey, but I'm already too deep to stop now. And there's one site we can access without permits or official channels, a place that's already been excavated and studied, where we can look for the same patterns without alerting anyone. Göbekli Tepe, Monroe said. Göbekli Tepe, Reeves confirmed. AC-4, the connection. They flew into Gaziantep, Turkey, in late May of 2024, travelling separately to avoid attention. Monroe used her journalist credentials to arrange interviews with local tourism officials, establishing a cover story about writing an article on archaeological tourism in southeastern Turkey. Reeves came as a tourist, just another visitor interested in ancient history. Göbekli Tepe is extraordinary even by mainstream archaeological standards. It's a massive stone temple complex dating back nearly 12,000 years, built by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture yet, hadn't developed writing, hadn't created permanent settlements or centralised authority. Yet somehow, these primitive hunter-gatherers organised the labour and expertise to quarry, carve, transport and erect stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in perfect circles with astronomical alignments and sophisticated artistic imagery. The site rewrites everything archaeologists thought they knew about the development of human civilization. The standard narrative says agriculture comes first, then permanent settlements, then social complexity, then monumental architecture, then religion and art. Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence completely. It suggests that religion and communal gathering came first, that the desire to build sacred spaces drove human development rather than practical concerns like food production and shelter. It's a reasonable theory, supported by evidence, accepted by mainstream archaeology as a revolutionary but legitimate discovery. But Reeves and Monroe weren't interested in the official narrative. They were looking for something else, for patterns that might connect Göbekli Tepe to the other suppressed sites they'd researched. They spent 3 days at the site, photographing everything, taking measurements, examining the carvings on the massive T-shaped pillars. The artistic imagery was sophisticated, depicting animals with anatomical accuracy that suggested close observation, geometric patterns that implied mathematical understanding, and strange symbols that might have been early writing or might have been something else entirely. On the 4th day, they met with Aydin Yilmaz, a retired geologist who had done core sampling work at Göbekli Tepe in the early 2000s. He'd agreed to meet them at a small cafe in Şanlıurfa, near a city, after Monroe contacted him through academic channels and mentioned that they were investigating unusual findings at ancient sites. Yilmaz was in his early 70s, lean and weathered, with the careful manner of someone who'd spent decades working with data that didn't fit comfortable explanations. He ordered tea for all of them, then got straight to the point. "You're asking about the metal traces," he said in English with a thick accent. "The anomalies I found in the core samples." "Yes," Monroe said. "We've seen similar patterns at other sites. Iridium traces, unusual isotopic ratios, material that doesn't match natural geological processes." Yilmaz nodded slowly. "I've kept my samples and data. Never published because the patterns didn't make sense, and I didn't want to risk my reputation on speculation without more evidence. But I've wondered for 20 years what those traces meant, where they came from." He had brought a box of materials with him, core samples stored in plastic tubes with handwritten labels, printouts of spectroscopic analysis from various labs, notebooks filled with calculations and observations. He spread it all on the table between them like evidence at a trial. Every core sample taken from the temple area shows metallic micro-residues, Yilmaz explained. The concentrations are small, parts per million, but they're consistently present throughout the site. The metallic signature is similar to what you'd find at meteor impact sites, high iridium content mixed with platinum group metals. But, Reeves prompted, but the isotopic ratios are wrong. Yilmaz pulled out a specific printout, pointed to columns of numbers. Natural meteors have characteristic isotopic signatures, specific ratios of different elements that match what we find in asteroid belt samples and other space debris. These samples don't match. The ratios are off by enough that it can't be explained by natural variation or contamination. Meaning? Monroe asked, though she already suspected the answer. Meaning this is manufactured alloy, not natural meteor material. Someone processed these metals deliberately, mixed them in specific proportions, created a material with properties that serve some purpose, and then someone used that material at this site 12,000 years ago. The implications hung in the air between them. Göbekli Tepe was already difficult to explain with conventional theories. Hunter-gatherers building massive stone temples was strange enough, but hunter-gatherers using manufactured extraterrestrial alloys? That pushed the boundaries of credible explanation into territory most archaeologists wouldn't touch. How widely distributed are the traces, Reeves asked. Are they concentrated in specific areas, or spread throughout the site? Yilmaz consulted his notebooks. Most concentrated around the central pillars in each circle, particularly at the base where the pillars were set into the bedrock. Also present in the soil layers associated with the construction period, less so in earlier or later layers. So whatever this material was, it was being used during the building phase, Monroe said, maybe as some kind of tool or equipment that left residue. Or maybe, Reeves said quietly, it was incorporated intentionally, some kind of marker or signature, something that would identify this location as important to whoever put it there. Yilmaz looked between them carefully. You're suggesting something beyond conventional archaeology. We're following evidence, Monroe said. Sometimes evidence leads to uncomfortable places. They spent another 2 hours going through Yilmaz's data, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The metallic traces were undeniably present. The isotopic analysis was rigorous and properly conducted, and the conclusion that the material was manufactured rather than natural was solidly supported by the data. As they were preparing to leave, Yilmaz added one more observation. There's something else I never understood. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe are very precise, tracking the positions of specific stars as they would have appeared 12,000 years ago. But there's one alignment that doesn't match any known celestial object, pointing to a region of space where nothing significant is visible. Where? Reeves asked. Yilmaz pulled out a star chart marked with calculations. The ecliptic south pole below the plane of the solar system. The pillars aligned to point towards something that would have been in that direction 12,000 years ago. Something important enough to memorialize in stone, but nothing we can identify today. Monroe and Reeves exchanged glances. The ecliptic south pole. The direction from which something might approach if it was coming from outside the solar system, or from a highly inclined orbit that took it far above or below the plane where the planets travel. That means someone brought it here, Monroe said after they'd left the cafe and were walking through Şanlıurfa's bustling streets. The Anunnaki, or whoever they actually were, they used manufactured materials. They had technology sophisticated enough to leave traces that last 12,000 years, and they built monuments aligned to point toward where they came from. Reeves was quiet for a moment, thinking through the implications. The tablets weren't offerings to gods. They were logs, records, an archive of what they did here, who they were, where they came from, and someone is finding those records and classifying them because the information is still relevant today. But relevant how? Monroe asked. What could ancient genetic engineering and extraterrestrial visitors have to do with current government and corporate interests? They didn't have an answer yet, but they were about to find one. Ast 5, Genesis 2. Back in London. In early June, Monroe continued working her intelligence sources, looking for any connection between the suppressed archaeological discoveries and current scientific research. She was looking for organisations that might have an interest in ancient genetic information, in extraterrestrial materials, in anything that connected past and present in the way she was beginning to suspect. It took 6 weeks of careful investigation, following money trails through corporate filings and grant applications, tracing personnel movements between government agencies and private research facilities, before she found the connection. Genesis 2. A classified research project launched in 2018 by a consortium that included biotech companies in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany and Japan, coordinated through government research agencies and funded by a mixture of public and private money hidden behind multiple layers of corporate structure. The project had a public face, occasionally mentioned in scientific journals and research publications. Officially, it was advanced genome editing research, building on CRISPR technology to develop treatments for genetic diseases. The papers describe sophisticated techniques for precisely modifying human DNA, correcting mutations that cause conditions like sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, potentially addressing thousands of genetic disorders. Legitimate medical research, the kind that gets funding from major institutions and regulatory approval from ethics boards. The kind of work that wins Nobel Prizes and changes the future of medicine. But Monroe obtained leaked internal communications through a source she would never name, a whistleblower who'd been disturbed by what they'd seen inside the project and felt the public needed to know. The documents painted a very different picture of what Genesis 2 was actually doing. The project wasn't just fixing genetic defects, it was reverse engineering something ancient, using information extracted from Sumerian texts that had been translated by specialists working for ArcGeo Solutions. One internal memo, dated March of 2022, laid it out clearly. Primary objective is not disease treatment but enhancement architecture. Using template sequences derived from recovered ancient genetic codices, cross-referenced with modern human genome mapping, we're identifying optimizations present in the original design that have degraded through evolutionary drift. Current protocols focus on neural efficiency, cellular regeneration capability, and lifespan extension through telomere integrity restoration. Another document described the source material. Cuneiform texts provided by Archon Bio Division contain remarkably detailed genetic instruction protocols, describable in modern terms as gene insertion sequences with specific ratio requirements. Text designates these as patterns set in clay, with binding pairs that encode various physiological traits. Direct correlation to chromosomal pair structure suggests source material authors possess sophisticated understanding of genetics. They weren't following mythology, they were following a recipe, instructions left behind by whoever created humans in the first place, now being decoded by scientists with the technology to understand what they were looking at. One file labelled Enki Protocol Primary Implementation outlined specific gene sequences being tested. The sequences were based on ratios described in ancient texts. 7 parts existing human genome to 3 parts modified sequence, introducing changes that enhance cognitive function, improved cellular repair mechanisms, extended natural lifespan, increased disease resistance. The scientific language was dense, full of technical terminology about protein synthesis and gene expression, and cellular signaling pathways. But the core concept was clear. Someone was attempting to recreate the Anunnaki's original work, to engineer humans according to an ancient template that had been preserved in cuneiform text for 45 centuries. One document contained a section that made Monroe's hands shake as she read it. Phase 1 trials completed successfully on 23 subjects. All binding pair modifications achieved stable integration. Subjects demonstrate enhanced cognitive processing, improved pattern recognition, extended concentration capability, physical health markers within acceptable ranges, no significant adverse effects observed. Proceeding to Phase 2 expansion to larger subject pool. 23 subjects, the same number of binding pairs mentioned in the ancient texts, the same number of chromosome pairs in the human genome, not coincidence, a deliberate correspondence, following the original design specifications. Another memo discussed the broader implications. If template sequences prove universally applicable across human populations, potential applications extend beyond medical treatment into augmentation territory. Military applications obvious, enhance soldiers with superior cognitive and physical capabilities. Economic applications significant, optimized workforce with reduced health costs and extended productive lifespan. Social engineering potential requires careful ethical consideration, but represents revolutionary capability for shaping human future. They weren't curing diseases, they were redesigning humanity according to ancient specifications left by whoever created us in the first place. And they were doing it under the cover of medical research, hidden behind classifications and corporate privacy, without public knowledge or democratic oversight. Monroe showed the documents to Reeves in late July. They met at a small flat she'd rented in East London under a false name, both of them increasingly paranoid about surveillance, after weeks of investigating organisations with significant resources and motivation to keep secrets. Reeves read through everything twice, his face growing paler as the implications sank in. They're not just studying ancient history, they're using it. They found instruction manuals for creating humans and they're following them. The Anunnaki weren't gods, Monroe said. They were genetic engineers. They came to Earth with specific purposes, modified existing primates to create a workforce suited to their needs, documented everything in records that survived as mythology. And now we've reached the point where we can understand those records and recreate their work. But why? Reeves asked. What's the purpose? If someone has the resources to do this, why hide it? Why not announce a breakthrough in genetic medicine and accept the accolades? Because it's not medicine, Monroe said. Or not just medicine. Look at the applications they're discussing. Military enhancement, workforce optimization, social engineering. They're talking about creating a new type of human, designed for specific purposes, just like the Anunnaki created us. Which makes us the gods this time, Reeves said slowly. We're doing to ourselves what was done to us, following the same pattern, repeating the cycle. Monroe pulled up one more document, the one that had disturbed her most. A progress report from April of 2024, just weeks after Reeves's dig at Eridu had been shut down. Eridu recovery operation successful. Additional genetic codices retrieved from sealed chamber, expanding template library significantly. New sequences under analysis, with particular focus on behavioural modification protocols and reproductive compatibility specifications, integration into Phase 3 planning underway. They'd gone back to Eridu after shutting down Reeves's excavation. They'd taken everything from the sealed chamber, all the information carved into those walls, and they were using it to advance their human redesign project. We have to expose this, Reeves said. We have to get this information public before they go too far. Monroe looked at him carefully. If we do that, we become major problems for very powerful people, organisations with government connections and corporate resources and no interest in having their work disrupted. I know, Reeves met her eyes. But if we don't, they keep going. They keep following ancient instructions to redesign humanity without consent, without oversight, without any consideration of what it means to fundamentally alter what humans are. Monroe nodded slowly. Then we need more evidence. Something irrefutable. Something that proves not just what they're doing, but what it's based on. We need to confirm that the Anunnaki were real, that their legacy is still active, that this isn't just mythology being misinterpreted by zealous scientists. The vault, Reeves said. The sealed chamber under Eridu. If we can get back there, If we can document what's actually in that chamber before Archon processes everything, we'll have evidence that connects past to present. That's incredibly dangerous. I know, but I have a contact in Iraq, someone from the original dig who might be able to help us get access. Monroe looked at the documents spread across the table, the evidence of a project that was redesigning human nature based on ancient genetic engineering specifications. When do we leave? Soon, Reeves said. Before they finish Phase 3 and whatever they're planning next. They started planning their return to Iraq. They arranged for encrypted backups of all their evidence, distributed to multiple trusted sources, with instructions to release everything if they didn't check in regularly. They prepared cover stories and travel arrangements, keeping everything compartmentalized and careful. By early September, they were ready to go. That was when everything accelerated in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Ast 6. The Earthquake. On April 10th, 2024, just 6 days after Reeves's excavation was shut down, a minor earthquake struck near Basra in southern Iraq. Magnitude 4.2 on the Richter scale, centred about 15 kilometres west of the city. It was barely noticed internationally, just another small seismic event in a geologically active region. Local news reported minor damage to buildings, some cracked roads, no casualties. Standard earthquake, nothing unusual. Iraq sits near the collision zone between the Arabian and Eurasian tectonic plates, so small quakes happen regularly. This one was slightly larger than average, but nothing catastrophic. Except something else happened during that earthquake, something that wasn't widely reported at the time but would become significant later. A subterranean facility was partially exposed about 8 kilometres from the earthquake's epicenter. Construction workers building a new industrial complex had been excavating for foundation work when the ground collapsed, revealing tunnels and chambers that had been hidden under centuries of sediment. Local engineers were called in to assess the structural damage and make sure nothing would collapse further. The industrial site was near oil infrastructure, so any ground instability was a serious concern. The engineers rappelled down into the newly opened void to map its extent and determine whether the surrounding area was safe. What they found didn't match their expectations at all. The tunnels were old, clearly ancient, carved into bedrock with precision that seemed impossible for primitive technology. But they weren't rough or irregular like natural caves. They were engineered, with smooth walls that showed tooling marks, regular dimensions that suggested deliberate design, and a layout that implied purpose rather than random formation. The engineers followed the main tunnel for about 30 metres before it opened into a larger chamber. That's where they found something that made them stop their survey and immediately contact Baghdad. In the centre of the chamber sat a sphere roughly 3 metres in diameter, partially unearthed by the earthquake's disruption of the surrounding soil. It was made of a dark stone-like material, smooth and slightly reflective, covered in inscriptions similar to ancient cuneiform but more complex, more dense with information, carved in layers that suggested multiple rounds of inscription over time. And it was active. The engineers' radio equipment started malfunctioning as soon as they entered the chamber, producing static and interference that made communication difficult. Their measuring instruments showed erratic readings, electromagnetic fields that shouldn't exist around inert stone. One engineer had brought a handheld thermal camera, and when he pointed it at the sphere, it registered a clear thermal signature. Heat generation that had no apparent source. They retreated quickly and made their report. The Iraqi government responded within hours, sending specialists from multiple agencies, cordoning off the area and issuing immediate classification orders that made the discovery state secret. But some of the engineers had made recordings on their personal phones. Some of them had downloaded the instrument data before it was confiscated, and some of them were disturbed enough by what they'd found that they leaked information to friends and family, who shared it on social media, who sent it to researchers and journalists who might know what it meant. Monroe had sources monitoring Middle Eastern social media and obscure forums where leakers sometimes posted information. In late April, One of those sources flagged a series of posts from Iraqi accounts describing the discovery, including grainy cell phone videos that showed the sphere in its chamber. The government's official statement came quickly: natural mineral formations exposed by the earthquake, unusual geological phenomena caused by groundwater interactions, nothing of concern, the site sealed for safety reasons. Standard bureaucratic language designed to dismiss curiosity and discourage investigation. But the cell phone footage showed something else. The sphere's surface was clearly covered in intentional inscriptions, not natural formations. The electromagnetic readings were documented in photos of instrument displays, and one video, shot from just a few meters away before the engineers retreated, showed something extraordinary. The inscriptions on the sphere were glowing very faintly, a barely visible blue luminescence that pulsed in slow rhythm. The pulse was regular, occurring approximately every 2 seconds, constant and precise like a heartbeat. Monroe obtained more data through her sources, including copies of the official technical survey that had been classified but leaked by someone inside the Iraqi government. The survey was thorough and professional, conducted by competent engineers who knew their work. The electromagnetic readings were consistent and measurable, showing field strengths that varied from approximately 0.3 to 0.8 milligauss, pulsing in the same 2-second cycle visible in the glowing inscriptions. The thermal signature measured roughly 3 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature, again pulsing with the same rhythm. Most importantly, the spectroscopic analysis of the sphere's material showed it wasn't any kind of natural stone. It was a composite, layers of different materials fused together with precision that required sophisticated manufacturing. The outer layer contained high concentrations of iridium and platinum group metals in manufactured alloy ratios identical to what Yilmaz had found at Göbekli Tepe. Someone had built this thing using extraterrestrial materials, buried it kilometers underground in southern Iraq, and left it in a state where it could remain functional for thousands of years. If they built man in their image, Monroe's voice recorded in a memo she prepared in May, what if they left themselves a way to come back? What if this isn't a monument or a record? What if it's a beacon still transmitting after all this time, sending a signal to whoever put it here that Earth is still here, still occupied, still relevant? She and Reeves had added the Basra discovery to their growing database of suppressed evidence, another piece of the pattern they were constructing. The timing was suspicious, occurring just days after the Eridu excavation was shut down, in the same region, exposing technology that matched the evidence Reeves had found. And the fact that it was still active, still generating electromagnetic fields and thermal signatures after thousands of years, suggested engineering far beyond anything ancient humans should have been capable of creating. By the time Monroe and Reeves were planning their return to Iraq in early September, they'd accumulated evidence of multiple sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia where advanced technology had been found and classified, where genetic information had been preserved in texts that modern scientists were now decoding and using. They'd connected past to present, shown that the Anunnaki weren't mythology but preserved memory of something real, demonstrated that modern organizations with significant resources were following ancient instructions to redesign human genetics. But they still needed something that would convince skeptics, something that would break through the natural resistance to believing something so extraordinary. They needed direct evidence from the source, from the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. That's where they went in mid-September of 2024, using contacts and careful planning to slip past the security that Archon had established around the site, and that's where they vanished. Act 7. The Global Link. While Monroe and Reeves were investigating suppressed archaeological sites and classified genetic research, other patterns were emerging on a global scale that seemed unrelated at first, but fit disturbingly well into the larger picture they had been assembling. In July of 2024, NASA quietly censored portions of deep space infrared data collected by the James Webb Space Telescope. The data had been made available to researchers through standard channels, then was suddenly reissued with sections marked as corrupted or containing instrumentation errors that rendered them unreliable. This wasn't entirely unusual. Space telescope data sometimes contains artifacts from cosmic ray impacts or sensor glitches, and corrections are routine. But the scope of the censoring was significant, affecting multiple observation periods focused on the outer solar system, particularly data collected while the telescope was imaging regions near Jupiter and beyond. Several astronomers who had already downloaded the original uncorrected data noticed something interesting in the sections that were later marked as corrupted. The infrared reading showed gravitational anomalies, subtle perturbations in the orbital paths of trans-Neptunian objects that suggested gravitational influence from something massive in the outer solar system. Not Neptune, not Pluto, not any of the known dwarf planets or large Kuiper belt objects. Something else, something big enough to affect multiple orbits in measurable ways. The astronomers started comparing notes in private communications, trying to determine whether the anomalies were real or actually instrumental errors. The data was ambiguous enough that reasonable people could disagree, but there was enough signal there to be intriguing. One researcher, an astrophysicist at MIT named Jennifer Kowalski, ran simulations based on the anomaly data to estimate what kind of object could produce the observed effects. Her preliminary results suggested a large planet-sized body, possibly several times Earth's mass, in a highly elliptical orbit that took it far beyond Pluto for most of its cycle, but brought it into the inner solar system periodically. The orbital parameters she calculated matched, with uncomfortable precision, predictions that had been made decades earlier by Zecharia Sitchin, a controversial author who had written extensively about ancient Sumerian texts and their descriptions of the Anunnaki. Sitchin's work had been largely dismissed by mainstream academics as pseudoscience, misinterpretations of ancient texts combined with faulty astronomy and wishful thinking. He claimed that Sumerian texts described a planet called Nibiru, massive and distant, whose highly elliptical orbit brought it close to Earth approximately every 3,600 years. When Nibiru approached, according to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, the Anunnaki would return to Earth, checking on their creation, harvesting resources, maintaining their ancient installations. The texts supposedly described multiple return visits throughout history, corresponding to major transitions in human civilization, like the rise of Sumerian culture and the Bronze Age collapse. Mainstream science had rejected all of this. The astronomical predictions didn't match any observed objects, the textual interpretations were considered overly literal and selective, and the whole narrative was dismissed as ancient astronaut pseudoscience that distorted real archaeology and history. But now, Kowalski's analysis based on actual observational data was producing orbital parameters that closely matched Sitchin's predictions, at least in broad strokes. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to be disturbing. She posted her preliminary findings on a preprint server used by astronomers to share work before formal peer review. Within days, her paper was flagged and removed, marked as violating terms of service for promoting fringe theories without adequate scientific basis. Her NASA data access was suspended pending review of her research protocols, but several dozen researchers had already downloaded her paper and the supporting data. Some of them started their own analyses, tried to replicate her findings, looked for other evidence of gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. The conversation spread through astronomical circles and spilled over into internet forums where amateur researchers and conspiracy theorists tracked evidence of official suppression and hidden knowledge. People started mapping Sitchin's predicted orbit against current planetary positions, calculating when a hypothetical Nibiru might be making its closest approach if it actually existed. The estimates varied depending on assumptions about orbital parameters, but most converged on a time frame in the mid to late 2020s, meaning now or very soon, meaning that if something was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, It might already be close enough to detect if anyone with access to good telescopes was looking in the right direction. Monroe had been tracking these developments through her network of sources, adding them to the overall picture she and Reeves were building. The astronomical data by itself wasn't conclusive, could easily be explained away as instrumental errors or misinterpretation of ambiguous measurements. But combined with everything else, with suppressed archaeological evidence and classified genetic research and ancient texts describing cyclic returns of the Anunnaki, it formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss. If Nibiru was real, if something massive was indeed approaching from the outer solar system, then what Monroe had asked in one of her notes became urgently relevant. What if the Anunnaki are already preparing Earth to receive them? She'd obtained one more document that tied everything together in ways that chilled her to read. A leaked memo from Archon Geo Solutions dated August of 2024, marked with classification levels that suggested it had been distributed only to senior personnel with specific clearances. The memo was brief, bureaucratic in tone, discussing project status in neutral technical language. Phase 3 genomic synchronization complete. Population markers within acceptable variance across target demographics. Template stability confirmed through 6-month monitoring of Phase 2 cohort. Neural enhancement protocols demonstrate sustained efficacy with no degradation. Cellular regeneration improvements holding stable. Awaiting return signal for Phase 4 implementation. Return signal. As if someone was expected to send a message. As if someone was coming back and would need certain preparations to have been completed before their arrival. Phase 4 was mentioned but not detailed in the memo Monroe had obtained, marked as classified above the document's security level. But the implication was clear. Genesis 2 had multiple phases planned, with each phase building toward some ultimate objective that required human populations to meet specific genetic criteria before implementation. If the Anunnaki were real, if they'd created humanity for specific purposes through genetic engineering, and if they were returning, then Phase 4 might be about ensuring their creations were ready, compatible, suitable for whatever purposes the Anunnaki had in mind, creating an interface, preparing a workforce, establishing compatibility between ancient genetic engineers and their modern redesigned product. Monroe had shared all of this with Reeves during their planning sessions before the Iraq trip, laying out the full scope of what they'd uncovered. The evidence was circumstantial, could be dismissed by skeptics as pattern matching and conspiracy thinking, but the pattern was consistent and the connections were documentable. "They're not coming back to check on us," Reeves had said after reading everything. "They're coming back to use us. We're a resource they created, a tool they left behind, and now they're making sure the tool is properly maintained and upgraded before they need it again." Which makes humanity what, Monroe had asked? Property, equipment, a biological technology they designed for specific purposes? Yes, Reeves said simply. And Genesis 2 is making sure we're functioning according to specifications, ready for whatever they have planned. That was the reality they were facing as they prepared to return to Erech, to investigate the sealed chamber under Eridu where it all began. They weren't just uncovering ancient history anymore. They were documenting an ongoing operation that spanned thousands of years, from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building towards something that might be imminent if the astronomical data was accurate. Their last communication before entering Iraq was an encrypted video sent to Marcus Webb, the independent researcher Monroe trusted as a dead man's switch. If they didn't return, he was supposed to release everything they'd found, make it public regardless of the consequences. "We've confirmed the existence of a sealed vault under Eridu," Monroe said in the video, her face serious but calm. "The coordinates match the old texts exactly. We're going in tonight with a local contact. The Anunnaki never left. They went underground." Reeves added his own thoughts. "If we're right, everything changes. Human history, human origin, the entire narrative of where we come from and why we're here. This isn't archaeology anymore. This is contact." Then darkness, movement, the video ending. That was September 21st, 2024. Neither Monroe nor Reeves has been heard from since. Act 8. The Last Transmission. The final piece of evidence, the most controversial and hardest to verify, emerged 6 weeks after Monroe and Reeves vanished. In late October of 2024, a video file appeared on an encrypted server known for hosting leaked classified material, a dark web location that had previously published government documents and corporate secrets. The server was shut down within hours of the video appearing, taken offline through coordinated action by multiple governments, but not before several researchers managed to download the file and distribute copies through other channels. The video is grainy handheld footage, clearly shot on a consumer camera or phone in challenging conditions with minimal lighting. The timestamp in the corner is corrupted, showing random characters instead of actual date and time, but forensic analysis of the visual artifacts and compression patterns suggests it was recorded in late September of 2024, consistent with when Monroe and Reeves disappeared. The video begins with darkness and the sound of heavy breathing, footsteps on stone. Then dim light appears, provided by small LED flashlights that create harsh shadows and limited visibility. The camera pans across walls of carved stone, underground, clearly ancient. But these walls aren't ordinary archaeological remains. They're covered in inscriptions that glow faintly with blue luminescence, not from external illumination, but from within the carvings themselves, as if the stone had been treated with some kind of luminescent material, or as if the inscriptions themselves were generating light through some unknown process. The glow pulses slowly, rhythmically, getting slightly brighter and dimmer in cycles that last about 2 seconds each. The pattern is identical across all the walls, synchronized as if controlled by some central mechanism. Rachel Monroe's voice, recognizable from other recordings, though the audio quality is poor. This isn't a tomb, it's not a temple or a storage vault, it's a system, a machine that's been asleep for thousands of years. The camera continues panning, and the inscriptions pulse brighter as the lens passes over them. The patterns are extraordinarily complex, layered information encoded in visual form, some characters recognizable as variations on Sumerian cuneiform, but others completely unknown, geometric and precise in ways that suggest mathematical or technical notation rather than linguistic meaning. "It's reacting to us," Reeves's voice says from behind the camera, tense with excitement or fear or both. "Our presence, our bioelectric fields, something, it's waking up. We're activating something that hasn't been active in millennia." The camera focuses on the centre of the chamber, showing a raised circular platform about 4 meters in diameter. The platform is made of the same glowing stone as the walls, with inscriptions arranged in concentric circles radiating from a depression in the exact centre. The depression is shaped vaguely like a handprint, but with 7 distinct contact points instead of 5, arranged in a pattern that doesn't match human anatomy. Each contact point is about 3 centimeters deep, smooth-sided, clearly intentional. Monroe moves into frame, approaches the platform carefully, examining the depression without touching it. "This is an interface," she says, "a control mechanism, but designed for something with different hands than humans, different number of digits, different proportions." "Don't touch it," Reeves says from behind the camera. "We don't know what it does, what it might activate." "I'm not going to," Monroe says, but she leans closer, examining the inscriptions around the depression. These symbols, they're instructions, sequential steps for operating something, and they reference the timing, the cycles, the return of... Oh God! Suddenly a low-frequency hum fills the audio, deep enough that it's probably felt more than heard, vibrating through the stone and the air, resonating in frequencies that make the camera shake slightly even though Monroe's hands are steady. The inscriptions on the walls brighten significantly, the blue glow intensifying and spreading through the carved channels like liquid flowing through irrigation canals, filling in patterns that weren't visible before, lighting up in sequence as if energy was moving through specific pathways. The hum increases in pitch and intensity, becoming almost musical, overtones harmonizing in ways that sound deliberately arranged, mathematically precise. The light flows toward the ceiling, concentrating on a central point directly above the platform where the walls curve to meet. The symbols arrange themselves into a configuration, a specific pattern that wasn't visible before when the inscriptions were inactive. The image is familiar, iconic even. The winged disc, the symbol seen on countless Sumerian tablets and Babylonian monuments. The representation of the Anunnaki's divine authority. But here it's not carved or painted. It's formed by light, by active energy, by a system that's functioning after being dormant for an incomprehensible length of time. The wings spread across the ceiling, geometric and regular, the central disc glowing brighter than the surrounding symbols, pulsing faster now, 4 or 5 times per second. "Oh God," Monroe's voice says, backing away from the platform. "We activated it. Marcus, if you're seeing this, we activated the beacon. We found the interface, and just being here, just entering this chamber, was enough to wake it up. They know we're here, they know we've found it. The system is transmitting." The light continues intensifying, the hum growing louder and more complex, layers of frequency stacking on each other in patterns that suggest information encoding, data transmission, a signal being sent through some medium that isn't apparent. The camera jerks as Reeves starts moving, backing toward what must be the entrance to the chamber. "We need to leave. We need to document this and get out before someone notices. If Arkan is monitoring this area, they'll know the beacon activated." But Monroe doesn't move immediately. She's staring at the ceiling, at the glowing winged disc, transfixed by what she's seeing. "It's not a warning," she says quietly, almost to herself. "It's an invitation. The beacon isn't saying stay away, it's saying we're ready. We're ready for you to come back." The video cuts to black abruptly, leaving only audio, sound of rapid breathing, footsteps on stone echoing an enclosed space, the hum still audible, but starting to fade as they move away from the chamber. Monroe's voice one more time, distant and echoing. The inscriptions describe the timing. 43 cycles since the beginning, each cycle 3,600 years. That's roughly 155,000 years since they first came. But the beacon triggers when humans reach sufficient development to find it and activate it. We just told them we're ready for the next phase. Then nothing. Static hiss of dead audio. The file ends. Conclusion. The pattern complete. So what does all of it mean? What are we supposed to do with this information? Let's lay out what we know, what can be documented, what's supported by leaked evidence and suppressed research that can be traced and verified by anyone willing to do the work. Multiple archaeological sites across the Middle East have yielded discoveries suggesting advanced knowledge that predates known human civilization. These discoveries have been systematically classified or suppressed by government agencies and private contractors acting in coordination. The pattern is consistent. Discovery, documentation, shutdown, silence. Eridu, Harran, Tel Brak, Susa, and others all following the same sequence. Ancient texts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and related cultures describe the Anunnaki not as spiritual beings, but as physical entities with technical knowledge, who created humans through processes that read like genetic engineering when translated carefully and literally. The texts specify ratios, binding pairs, sequential procedures that correlate with modern genetic science in ways that shouldn't be possible for ancient writers working with primitive understanding. Modern genetic research programs, classified and operating under cover of medical research, are using information extracted from these ancient texts to modify human genetics according to ancient template specifications. The Genesis 2 project exists, its documentation is real, and its objectives include human enhancement based on ancient genetic codices recovered from archaeological sites. Astronomical observations suggest possible gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system consistent with a large planetary body in a highly elliptical orbit, though the data is ambiguous enough that reasonable skepticism is warranted. The orbital parameters loosely match ancient predictions about a wandering planet that returns periodically. Underground installations have been discovered in Iraq containing technology that shouldn't exist, devices made from manufactured extraterrestrial alloys that remain functional after thousands of years of burial, transmitting signals or maintaining readiness for purposes unknown. That's the documented reality, the evidence that exists regardless of how we interpret it. The skeptical explanation remains available. Coincidence, misinterpretation, pattern matching by investigators who wanted to find connections and therefore found them. The ancient texts are mythology being overinterpreted. The genetic research is legitimate medical science, with connections to archaeology being exaggerated. The astronomical data is instrumental error. The underground technology is misidentified natural formations or modern installations mistaken for ancient ones. Everything could be explained away if you're committed to conventional narratives and uncomfortable with extraordinary possibilities. But what if it's not? What if every piece of evidence is genuine? What if the Anunnaki were real, physical beings who came to Earth from somewhere else, who understood genetics and engineering in ways that seemed like magic to primitive humans who witnessed their work, who created humanity for specific purposes through deliberate modification of existing species? Then the implications reshape everything we think we know about ourselves. Human history isn't what we've been taught. We're not the product of purely natural evolution, or at least not entirely. We're designed, engineered, created by beings with capabilities far beyond what our ancestors could comprehend. Those beings documented their work in texts that survived as mythology, preserved through countless retellings and translations because the information was too important to lose completely. They left installations, buried technology, monitoring systems that could remain dormant for thousands of years and reactivate when the right conditions were met. The conditions being humans developed enough to find the installations, understand what they were looking at, and trigger the systems that would signal our creators that we'd reached sufficient sophistication. We call them myths because it's easier than calling them memories. Because accepting them as memories means accepting that everything we think we know about human origin and human nature might be incomplete at best, deliberately obscured at worst. It means accepting that we might not be alone in the universe, and that we never have been. That we're part of something larger, an operation that spans thousands of years from humanity's creation to our present moment, all building toward purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. And the scariest part? We might have just activated the signal that tells them to come back. The sealed chamber under Eridu exists. The inscriptions are real, carved by people with knowledge that predates any known civilization. The beacon, if that's what it is, was dormant until human investigators entered that space and triggered systems that had been waiting for exactly that moment. Monroe and Reeves found it. They activated it. They documented what happened and sent one final message before vanishing. Were they captured by Archon personnel monitoring the site? Are they being held somewhere, prevented from revealing what they discovered? Are they dead? Casualties of knowing too much and threatening powerful interests that want this information suppressed? Or are they somewhere else entirely? Somewhere underground in chambers lit by blue circuits carved in ancient stone, waiting with whatever they found there for the signal to be answered, for the creators to return and complete whatever plan has been unfolding since the beginning. The Eridu excavation remains officially sealed, classified under a multinational directive that hasn't been explained or justified to anyone outside the agencies involved. Archon Geo Solutions continues operating in Iraq, their activities hidden behind corporate privacy and government classification, their purpose known only to senior personnel with appropriate clearances. Genesis 2 continues its work, publishing occasional papers about genetic medicine, while pursuing objectives that remain classified, following ancient instructions to redesign humanity according to specifications left by our creators. and something might be approaching from the outer solar system, massive and distant, following an orbit that brings it close to Earth on a schedule measured in thousands of years, close enough matter, close enough to allow whoever or whatever created us to return and check on their work. Daniel Reeves and Rachel Monroe remain missing. Officially, there's no evidence of foul play, no reason to suspect anything beyond two adults choosing to disappear. Their families still hope they'll come home. Investigators have found nothing. Officially, nothing unusual happened in Iraq in 2024. Officially, the Anunnaki are mythology, ancient stories told by primitive people trying to make sense of a confusing world. Officially, humanity evolved naturally through millions of years of random mutation and natural selection. No intervention required, no outside influence needed to explain our consciousness or capabilities. Officially, we're alone. We've always been alone. And the gods who shaped us from clay are nothing more than stories. But late at night, when you're drifting off to sleep, when the rational mind loosens its grip and older instincts surface, maybe you'll wonder. Maybe you'll think about the winged disc carved on tablets 5,000 years old, glowing in underground chambers that haven't been opened in millennia. Maybe you'll think about the impossible precision of ancient structures, the sophisticated knowledge encoded in cuneiform that nobody should have possessed, the stories every civilization tells about gods who came from the sky and made humans in their image. Maybe you'll look up at the stars and wonder what's out there in the dark, beyond Neptune and Pluto, in the cold reaches where orbits take thousands of years to complete. Maybe you'll wonder if something is coming closer, making its slow, inevitable approach toward the inner solar system, toward the planet where its creation waits. Maybe you'll wonder if we were designed to wonder, if curiosity itself is part of the program, if every question we ask brings us closer to the answers they left for us to find when we were finally sophisticated enough to understand them. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realise that the beacon has already been activated, that the signal has already been sent, that we've announced ourselves to whoever created us, told them we've reached the development level they were waiting for, triggered the systems they left to monitor our progress. The Anunnaki aren't coming back. They're already here. They've always been here, waiting in chambers beneath Eridu and Göbekli Tepe, and a dozen other sites along the arc of ancient Mesopotamia, sleeping in technology we mistake for ancient stone, encoded in the very DNA that makes us human, preserved in texts we dismissed as mythology for thousands of years, waiting for us to be ready, waiting for us to find them, waiting for us to fulfill whatever purpose they designed us for when they shaped the clay and called it human, and set us on a path that led inevitably to this moment. Phase 4 is coming. The return signal has been sent, and we're about to discover what we were actually created for all those thousands of years ago when beings from somewhere else decided Earth needed a workforce designed to specifications they could control. Sweet dreams. Picture this. You're flying cargo over the Arctic Circle when your instruments go haywire. The aurora borealis dances above, but something's wrong. The lights pulse in patterns too perfect to be natural. Your cargo manifest says environmental sensors, but the weight matches military hardware. Welcome to tonight's story, where the beautiful northern lights hide a weapons program so classified that even acknowledging its existence could land you in federal prison. Before we dive into Mason Fry's dangerous discovery, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're loving these late-night journeys into the shadows of truth, hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, kill your lights, settle in, and prepare for a story that will make you question every government environmental project you've ever heard about. Act 1. The Ordinary Job. The de Havilland DHC-5. Buffalo's engines roared against the Arctic wind as Mason Fry guided the old cargo plane through another milk run to nowhere. At 29, he'd traded the structured chaos of Air Force logistics for the supposedly simpler life of civilian freight. But the routes up here, supply runs to research stations scattered across the Canadian Arctic, sometimes made him wonder if he'd actually left military service at all. Yellowknife Control, this is Caribou 779, currently at flight level 180, approximately 200 nautical miles out from Aurora Station. Mason spoke into his headset, the familiar routine of position reports keeping him grounded in the endless white below. Roger 779. Weather holding steady, winds from the northwest at 30 knots. Aurora Station reports ready to receive. Aurora Station. In the 6 months since Mason had started flying for North Star Logistics, he'd made this run twice a month. Officially, it was a joint US-Canadian renewable energy research facility, part of the big push toward Arctic sustainability. The press releases talked about revolutionary methods to harness the aurora borealis itself, electromagnetic induction on a massive scale, turning the northern lights into humanity's newest power source. It sounded like science fiction, which is probably why most people dismissed it as another government boondoggle, throwing money at impossible dreams while practical problems went unsolved. But Mason had learned to pay attention to details during his Air Force days, and Aurora Station set off every instinct he'd developed loading classified cargo onto C-130s in Afghanistan. The manifest for today's flight was typical of what had been making him uneasy. 3 pallets of atmospheric monitoring equipment that required reinforced tie-downs typically used for armoured vehicles. 4 crates labelled renewable energy components with handling instructions warning against electromagnetic interference. And most curious, a single container marked only with a NATO stock number and the words "Technical Manual Set, Classified Handling Required." Since when does renewable energy research need classified technical manuals? Mason muttered to his co-pilot Derek Chen, who'd been flying Arctic routes for 15 years. Derek shrugged, focused on monitoring the instruments. Government contracts, man. They classify their toilet paper if they could bill extra for it. But as they descended toward Aurora Station's ice runway, Mason noticed something he'd been tracking for months. His instruments always acted up at exactly the same point in the approach, roughly 5 miles out. The magnetic compass would spin lazily. The radio would fill with static that had an almost rhythmic quality, and the GPS would briefly show their position as somewhere in the South Pacific, before snapping back to reality. The station itself looked unremarkable from the air, a collection of prefab buildings connected by enclosed walkways, some communication towers, and what appeared to be a large solar panel array. But Mason had noticed things. The solar panels were angled wrong for optimal sun exposure at this latitude. The communication towers were too numerous and too varied for a simple research station. And then there were the tyre tracks. Heavy vehicle tracks led from the main cargo receiving area, not to the visible buildings, but to a low mound about 300 metres away. The tracks disappeared at the mound's base, suggesting an entrance hidden beneath the snow. Every delivery the tracks were fresh, but Mason had never seen the vehicles that made them. After landing and supervising the offload, the Aurora Station crew always insisted on handling the cargo themselves with their own equipment. Mason took his usual walk to stretch his legs while Derek handled the paperwork. The station personnel were friendly enough, but had the kind of studied casualness that reminded him of intelligence officers he'd encountered at forward operating bases. They answered questions without really saying anything, smiled without warmth, and always seemed to be watching even when looking away. This time Mason wandered closer to the mysterious mound. As he approached, he felt a vibration through his boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from deep underground. His phone, which had been showing no signal, suddenly blazed to life with full bars before immediately dying. Its battery drained from 60% to 0 in seconds. "You should stick to the marked paths," a voice said behind him. Mason turned to find a woman in Aurora Station gear, her badge identifying her as Emily Reeves, Site Safety Coordinator. Permafrost out here can be unstable. Wouldn't want you falling into a crevasse. Mason looked at the flat, solid ground around them. Right, crevasses. Emily's smile was professional. The Arctic is full of hidden dangers, Mason. Best to stay where it's safe. That night, back in Yellowknife, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that Aurora Station was wrong in ways that went beyond suspicious cargo and hidden entrances. He'd been to legitimate research stations. Scientists were usually eager to talk about their work, proud to show off their equipment. Aurora Station's personnel acted like they were guarding state secrets, which Mason was beginning to suspect they were. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Aurora Station. The official website was slick and professional, full of stock photos of wind turbines and solar panels, with vague descriptions of cutting-edge electromagnetic research and sustainable Arctic development. But when he dug deeper, things got interesting. The station had been established in 2019, but the land lease went back to 1987, originally designated for a communications research facility that was apparently never built. The primary contractor wasn't a renewable energy company, but Atlas Defense Solutions, a firm Mason recognised from his Air Force days. They specialised in electronic warfare systems. His phone rang, showing an unknown number with a Virginia area code. Mason Fry? The voice was professional, crisp. Who's asking? Someone who knows you've been asking questions about Aurora Station. Questions that could be misinterpreted. I'm calling as a courtesy, military to military. Some doors are better left unopened. Is that a threat? It's advice. You have a good job, a clean record, a future. Don't jeopardise that over curiosity about things that don't concern you. The line went dead. Mason stared at his phone, then at his laptop screen showing Atlas Defense Solutions Board of Directors, 3 former Pentagon officials and a retired Air Force general who'd overseen strategic defense initiatives. Whatever Aurora Station was really doing up there in the Arctic, it had nothing to do with renewable energy. Act 2. The Anomaly. 2 weeks later, Mason was nursing a beer at the Gold Range, Yellowknife's infamous Strange Range bar, when Tobias Winters slid into the booth across from him. Tobias was what the locals called a radio rat, a ham radio enthusiast who spent his nights listening to signals bouncing off the ionosphere, talking to strangers on the other side of the world from his cabin 20 miles outside town. "You're the pilot who flies to Aurora Station," Tobias said. It wasn't a question. "One of them, yeah." Tobias leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement Mason associated with conspiracy theorists and true believers. "I need to show you something, but not here." An hour later, Mason stood in Tobias's cabin, surrounded by enough radio equipment to stock a small broadcast station. Vintage receivers sat next to modern software-defined radios, their displays dancing with waterfall patterns of received signals. The walls were covered with QSL cards, postcards from other radio operators around the world, and maps marked with red pins and string, tracking something Mason couldn't immediately identify. "Listen to this," Tobias said, adjusting dials on receiver. Static filled the room, then cleared to reveal a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, but electronic. "I started picking this up 3 months ago, always at the same time, 0300 UTC, always from the same direction." He pointed to a map where several string lines converged on a point in Nunavut. Aurora Station. "Could be equipment interference," Mason suggested, though he was remembering his instruments going haywire on approach. "That's what I thought. But then I noticed the pattern." Tobias pulled out a notebook filled with timestamps and frequency measurements. The pulses correspond exactly to Aurora Borealis activity. When the northern lights are strong, the pulses are strong. When they're weak, the pulses are weak. So they're studying the aurora. That's what they claim to be doing. Studying? Or harvesting? Tobias flipped to another page. "I've been tracking unexplained blackouts across the Arctic. Small communities, usually lasting just a few minutes, barely making the news, They follow a pattern. He laid a transparent sheet over a map showing dots connected by lines. Every blackout occurs along a line between Aurora Station and wherever the aurora is most active. Mason studied the map, his unease growing. You're saying they're pulling power from the aurora? Or pushing something through it? Watch this. Tobias turned to a computer, pulling up an audio file. This is a transmission I intercepted last week. It's encrypted, but the header was in the clear long enough to identify the sender and recipient. The screen showed sender, Aurora. Actual, recipient, Chrysalis Command. Chrysalis Command? Mason had never heard the designation. Traced it through signal analysis. The response came from a building in Arlington, Virginia. Officially, it's office space leased to a company called Electromagnetic Solutions International. But check this out. Tobias pulled up a corporate registration. ESI is a wholly owned subsidiary of Atlas Defense Solutions. The same company Mason had identified as Aurora Station's primary contractor. There's more, Tobias continued. My friend in Fort Smith, another radio operator, he's been documenting wildlife deaths. Entire flocks of birds falling from the sky, always during or immediately after the pulses, and look at the dates. Mason compared the lists. Every unexplained wildlife death corresponded to a cargo delivery he'd made to Aurora Station. Whatever you're flying up there, Tobias said, it's not environmental sensors. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those heavy pallets, the classified technical manuals, the underground entrance hidden beneath the snow. At 3 a.m, he gave up and drove to the North Star Logistics warehouse at the airport. The night shift knew him. Didn't question when he said he'd left something in the plane. He made his way to the cargo area where tomorrow's Aurora Station shipment was being staged. Most of the crates were the usual, sealed, labelled with technical descriptions that could mean anything. But one pallet, set apart from the others, made him pause. It was covered with a tarp, but the corner had come loose. Underneath was a cylindrical device about the size of a water heater, made of what looked like copper coiling wrapped around a ceramic core. Stencilled on its side was Resonance Amplifier MK7, and below that, Caution, High Energy Electromagnetic Device. Mason quickly photographed it with his phone, then noticed something else. A shipping label that had partially peeled off, revealing another label underneath. The visible label showed Aurora Station as the destination. The hidden one showed an origin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Nuclear Weapons Division. His phone suddenly grew hot in his hand. The screen flickered, showing impossible error messages before going completely dead. Not powered off. Dead, as if the electronics had been fried. You shouldn't be here, Mason. He spun to find Emily Reeves, the safety coordinator from Aurora Station, standing in the warehouse doorway. She wasn't wearing Arctic gear now, but black tactical clothing that suggested a very different job description. How did you... We've been monitoring you since your first call to Tobias Winters. We know about his intercepts. We know about your research. And we know you just photographed classified defense equipment. So what now? You disappear me? Emily sighed. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, we don't disappear curious civilians. Too messy, too many questions. But you put us in a difficult position. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, connected dots that should have remained scattered. What is Aurora Station really doing? Emily was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words. Have you ever heard of the Carrington event? 1859. A solar storm so powerful it set telegraph wires on fire, made the aurora visible as far south as the Caribbean. Mason nodded. Now imagine being able to harness that power to create focused electromagnetic pulses using the aurora as a natural amplifier, not as a weapon. That's thinking too small. As a communication system that can't be intercepted, can't be jammed, can't be traced. A way to send signals through the Earth's magnetic field itself. The blackouts, the dead birds. Regrettable side effects we're working to minimize. The technology is still being perfected. And if I don't keep quiet, then you'll find your life becoming very complicated. Your employer will discover discrepancies in your flight logs. The DEA will receive an anonymous tip about suspicious cargo movements. Your bank will flag your accounts for potential terrorism financing. Emily stepped closer. Or you can forget what you've seen, continue flying your routes, and enjoy the substantial raise North Star Logistics is about to offer you to retain such a valued pilot. Mason looked at the resonance amplifier, at Emily, at the warehouse full of secrets heading north. The people in those communities, the ones experiencing blackouts, they don't get a choice in being your test subjects. No, Emily agreed, or they don't. But then, when has anyone asked the Arctic's opinion about anything? Mining, drilling, missile tests? It's always been humanity's laboratory for things too dangerous to try anywhere else. Act 3. Following the money. Mason took the raise. He kept flying to Aurora Station, but he also started documenting everything. Every manifest got photographed. Every unusual cargo weight got logged. Every instrument anomaly got recorded. He created encrypted backups, stored on servers in countries with no extradition treaties. And late at night he traced money. North Star Logistics, it turned out, was more interesting than he had expected. On paper it was a small Canadian freight company, family-owned for 3 generations, but its primary contract, the Aurora Station runs, paid 10 times the market rate for Arctic cargo delivery. The payments came not from the Canadian government or even directly from Atlas Defence Solutions, but through a web of intermediary companies that took Mason weeks to untangle. The trail led to something called the Electromagnetic Defense Initiative, a Pentagon office that officially existed for only 18 months in 1987 to 1988, during the height of Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program. Officially, the office had been disbanded, its research deemed unfeasible. Unofficially, Mason discovered it had been reconstituted under different names every few years, moving between departments, always maintaining a budget that was small enough to avoid congressional scrutiny, but large enough to fund significant research. The current incarnation was hidden in the Department of Energy's budget as the Arctic Environmental Protection Program, $68 million annually, ostensibly for studying the impact of climate change on polar electromagnetic phenomena. Mason found the smoking gun in a General Accounting Office report from 2003, buried in an appendix about cost overruns. A single line item: recovery and analysis of foreign technical materials, Operation Northern Light, location, classified Arctic Site 7. Operation Northern Light. Mason searched for any reference to it, finding only fragments. A mention in a Canadian defence document about joint recovery operations. A redacted Air Force report about anomalous satellite debris. And finally, in a declassified CIA assessment of Soviet military capabilities, a single paragraph. The loss of Cosmos 2341 over the Canadian Arctic in 1987 represents a significant intelligence opportunity. The satellite, believed to be testing experimental electromagnetic pulse technology, broke apart at an altitude of 200 kilometres. Debris field analysis suggests primary payload may have survived re-entry. Recovery efforts should be prioritised. Aurora Station sat directly on the projected debris field of Cosmos 2341. Mason met Tobias at a truck stop 50 miles from Yellowknife, away from any potential surveillance. They're not developing their own technology, Mason explained, showing Tobias his findings. They're reverse engineering Soviet EMP weapons that crashed there in 1987. The Aurora isn't just a power source, it's an amplifier for weapons designed to work with the Earth's magnetic field. Tobias studied the documents. This is beyond what I imagined. If they can weaponize the Aurora itself, they could create targeted electromagnetic pulses anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, knock out power grids, communications, military equipment, and it would look like a natural phenomenon, just a particularly strong interaction between solar wind and the magnetosphere. We need to go public with this. Mason shook his head. With what? Financial records that could be explained as legitimate research funding? Speculation about 30-year-old satellite crashes? They'll deny everything, and will look like conspiracy theorists. Then what do? We get proof. Real, undeniable proof. The opportunity came 3 weeks later. A massive solar storm was forecast, the kind that would set the aurora blazing across the entire Arctic. Aurora Station requested an emergency supply run. They needed additional equipment to take advantage of optimal conditions for renewable energy testing. Mason volunteered for the flight. The cargo was different this time, smaller, more numerous packages, each one marked with radiation warnings and handling instructions that suggested volatile materials. Derek, his usual co-pilot, had called in sick, replaced at the last minute by someone Mason didn't recognise, a quiet man named Johnson who said little and watched everything. As they approached Aurora Station, the instruments didn't just glitch, they went completely haywire. The compass spun like a tornado, the altimeter showed them at negative altitude, and the radio filled with what sounded like voices speaking backwards. Through the cockpit window, the aurora wasn't its usual curtain of green light, but geometric patterns, almost like circuit boards drawn in the sky. "Jesus Christ," Johnson muttered, the first genuine emotion Mason had heard from him. They actually did it. That's when Mason realised Johnson wasn't just a replacement pilot. He was here to observe the test. They landed in near whiteout conditions, the aurora so bright it cast multiple shadows. The Aurora Station crew worked with unusual urgency, unloading the cargo directly onto vehicles that immediately headed toward the hidden entrance Mason had observed months ago. "I need to check something in the cargo hold," Mason told Johnson. "Thought I heard something shift during that turbulence." Johnson looked sceptical but nodded. "Make it quick." "We're wheels up in 30 minutes. Mason made his way to the cargo hold, then slipped out the rear door. The storm provided perfect cover, visibility down to mere meters. He followed the vehicle tracks toward the mound, the vibration through the ground growing stronger with each step. The entrance was exactly where he'd suspected. A ramp leading down, wide enough for vehicles, concealed by camouflage netting covered with snow. Mason descended. His phone, a new one, wrapped in aluminum foil until now, recording everything. The tunnel led to a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. But it wasn't the size that stopped Mason in his tracks. It was the contents. Arranged in a precise pattern were dozens of the resonance amplifiers he'd seen in the warehouse, all connected by thick cables to a central platform. On the platform was something that clearly didn't belong to any Earth-based military, a spherical device about 3 meters across, its surface covered in Cyrillic text and symbols that looked more like circuit diagrams than writing. Soviet technology, but advanced beyond anything that should have existed in 1987. Scientists and technicians in hazmat suits swarmed around the equipment, making final adjustments. Mason recognised Emily Reeves, now in military fatigues, speaking into a radio. "Chrysalis Command, this is Aurora Actual. We are T-minus 5 minutes from pulse generation. Target coordinates locked. Grid reference, November 7-7. Communications hub at Fort Greely. Pulse duration 3 seconds, expected downtime 15 minutes, confirm receipt. Fort Greely, home to the US military's missile defense system." Mason recorded everything. The phone's memory filling with evidence of a weapon test disguised as energy research, targeting American military infrastructure. He was so focused on documenting that he almost missed the footsteps behind him. "I really hoped you'd taken our advice," Emily said, flanked by 2 security contractors with rifles. "Now things get complicated." Act 4, The Leak in the Chase. Mason raised his hands, the phone still recording in his chest pocket. "Testing EMP weapons on your own military. That's treason, isn't it?" Emily smiled coldly. "Treason implies working against your country's interests. We're ensuring America maintains electromagnetic superiority in an age where conventional weapons are becoming obsolete. The Fort Greely test is calibrated to create minor repairable disruptions, just enough to test our countermeasures. And the Canadian government? Do they know you're using their territory for weapons testing?" "The Canadians know exactly what we've told them. that we're researching Aurora-based renewable energy. The underground facility doesn't officially exist. A klaxon sounded. T-minus 60 seconds, an automated voice announced. You should see this, Emily said, gesturing toward an observation window. You've risked everything to learn our secret. Might as well witness history. Through the window, Mason could see the central device beginning to glow. The resonance amplifiers hummed in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in his bones. Above, through monitors showing external cameras, the aurora twisted into impossible shapes. Spirals, grids, focused beams of light that seemed to reach down toward the earth. 30 seconds. Mason felt his phone growing warm in his pocket, the electromagnetic field beginning to affect its electronics, despite the foil shielding. The Soviet device was supposed to be a doomsday weapon, Emily explained, her eyes fixed on the glowing sphere, able to create a cascade effect through the magnetosphere, knocking out electronics across entire continents. We've refined it, controlled it, turned it into a precision instrument. 10 seconds. The harmonic vibration reached a crescendo. Mason's vision blurred, his inner ear screaming conflicting information about up and down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pulse initiated. The sphere erupted in light. Not visible light, but something that made every nerve ending fire at once. The monitors showed the aurora focusing into a column of energy that seemed to punch through the atmosphere itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Pulse complete. Chrysalis command confirming target impact. Fort Greely communications offline. Secondary effects minimal. Test successful. The technicians erupted in celebration. Emily turned to Mason with satisfaction. 15 minutes from now, Fort Greely's systems will come back online. They'll blame it on solar storm interference. No permanent damage, no evidence, no questions asked. Except I have everything on video, Mason said. Emily's smile didn't waver. Your phone died 30 seconds ago. EMP, even the residual field, is hell on electronics. She gestured to the security contractors. Take him to holding. We'll figure out what to do with him after the team clears out. As they marched him through the facility, Mason mentally catalogued everything. Escape routes, personnel numbers, equipment details. The holding cell was a repurposed storage room, solid walls, electronic lock. They searched him thoroughly, finding the dead phone, his wallet, keys, even the pen from his flight suit. But they didn't find the micro SD card hidden in the heel of his boot, where he'd transferred the video just before the phone died. 4 hours later, the facility had gone quiet. Skeleton crew only, most personnel evacuated after the successful test. Mason had spent the time working on the door's lock mechanism. Electronic, yes, but with a manual override required by fire code. His Air Force survival training had included a week with a CIA operative who taught them things that weren't in any official manual. The lock clicked open just as he heard footsteps approaching. Johnson, the replacement pilot, stood in the hallway. We need to leave. Now, Johnson said. Who are you really? Canadian Security Intelligence Service. We've suspected Aurora Station's true purpose for 2 years, but couldn't prove it. Your little adventure gave us the excuse to insert assets. This place will be crawling with Canadian military in 6 hours, but you need to be gone before then. They made their way through the facility, now nearly deserted. Johnson had disabled the security cameras, creating a blind spot in the surveillance. At the motor pool, they acquired a snowmobile, Johnson producing keys from his pocket. They'll notice we're gone within the hour, Johnson said as they raced across the tundra toward the aircraft. But there's a problem. Your plane's been disabled. They pulled the control circuit breakers. Mason grinned. They pulled the ones they could see, DHC-5. Buffalo has redundant systems from its military days, hidden behind the cargo panels. Give me 10 minutes. As Mason worked to restore the aircraft's electrical systems, Johnson kept watch. You have evidence. Mason tapped his boot. Everything, but if I release it, they'll destroy me. Not if it comes from multiple sources simultaneously. I've got my own recordings, and there are others. Scientists who've grown uncomfortable with the weapons application. Military personnel who believe this violates treaties. We release together. They can't suppress it all. The engines coughed to life just as lights appeared on the horizon, vehicles approaching fast. Go! Johnson shouted. I'll delay them. Mason didn't argue. He pushed the throttles forward, the old Buffalo lurching into motion. The ice runway wasn't lit, but the aurora provided enough illumination. As he lifted off, he saw Johnson's snowmobile racing toward the approaching vehicles, playing chicken with military precision. The flight to Yellowknife was the longest 2 hours of Mason's life. No radio contact. That would give away his position. Flying low to avoid radar, navigating by compass and instinct, expecting at any moment to see fighter jets appearing on his tail. But he made it. At Yellowknife Airport, he didn't go to the North Star hangar. Instead, he landed at the general aviation area, where Tobias waited with a van. Drive, Mason said, climbing in. Alaska. I have a contact at Elmendorf Air Force Base who'll help us get this to the right people. As they drove south, Mason uploaded the video to 17 different servers, each with a dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 24 hours, the footage would automatically release to major news outlets, WikiLeaks, and every government oversight committee he could think of. His phone, Tobias's spare, rang immediately. Unknown Virginia number. Mr. Fry, you're making a serious mistake. It was a new voice, older, with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The only mistake was thinking you could test weapons on Allied facilities without consequences. You don't understand the geopolitical implications. China and Russia are developing similar capabilities. If our research becomes public, it accelerates their programs. Maybe if it's public, there'll be pressure for treaties, for control. You're naive. Release that footage and you'll be charged under the Espionage Act. You'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Only if you can find me. Mason hung up and removed the phone's battery. They drove for 18 hours straight, crossing into British Columbia, then Alaska. At the border, Mason expected trouble, but Johnson had apparently worked magic. Their crossing was smooth, no alerts, no delays. Act 5, The Showdown. Mason's contact at Elmendorf was Captain Sarah Park, an intelligence officer he'd worked with in Afghanistan. She met them at a truck stop outside Anchorage, her expression grim. Mason, what have you gotten yourself into? There are flash alerts about you on every military and intelligence network. They're calling you a foreign agent, saying you stole classified materials. Mason handed her the microSD card. Watch this, then tell me who the real threat is. They sat in her car as she viewed the footage on a secure laptop. Her face went pale as she watched the test, heard Emily's casual admission about targeting Fort Greely. They actually hit our own base? Check the logs for that night. 15-minute communication blackout blamed on solar storm activity. Sarah pulled up the incident reports on her classified network. There it was. Fort Greely. Complete communications failure from 0347 to 0402 local time. Attributed to extreme auroral electromagnetic interference. They're testing weapons on American military installations, she breathed. This is beyond illegal. It's an act of war against our own forces. Can you get this to someone who'll act on it? Sarah was quiet for a moment. I know someone at the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Someone who's been investigating black budget programs. But Mason, even with this evidence, they have resources you can't imagine. They'll discredit you, destroy your reputation, possibly worse. Then we don't give them just one target. Mason pulled out a list he and Tobias had compiled. 47 journalists, 12 congressional staffers, 8 foreign intelligence services who'd be very interested to know about an Arctic EMP weapon. We release simultaneously, globally. They can't suppress everyone. That could start a war. Or prevent one. If everyone knows about the weapon, it loses its strategic value. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, then cursed. Military police, heading this way. Someone tracked my vehicle. Through the truck stop window they could see vehicles approaching. Black SUVs, no plates, windows tinted. Back door, Tobias said, already moving. They rushed through the kitchen, startling the cook, and out into the rear parking area. Sarah's personal vehicle, a nondescript Honda, was parked there. "Take my car," she said, tossing Mason the keys. "I'll deal with them. Buy you time." As they drove away, Mason saw in the mirror Sarah walking calmly toward the approaching SUVs, her hands visible, credentials ready. She was sacrificing her career, possibly her freedom, for the truth. They drove to a cabin Tobias knew, 40 miles from Anchorage. No cell coverage, completely off-grid. There, using a satellite internet connection that couldn't be traced to the location, they prepared to release everything. But Mason hesitated. "What's wrong?" Tobias asked. "Johnson, the Canadian agent, Sarah, others who've helped us. If we release this, they'll suffer too. Then we're selective. We redact names, protect sources, focus on the technology, the violation of treaties, the tests on allied facilities, make it about the program, not the people." They spent 6 hours editing, redacting, creating a package that exposed the Aurora Directive while protecting those who'd risked everything to help them. At midnight Alaska time, Mason hit send. Within minutes, his satellite connection was severed, but it was too late. The information was out, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The response was immediate and chaotic. The Pentagon denied everything. The Canadian government demanded explanations. Environmental groups seized on the wildlife deaths. Military families questioned whether other equipment failures had been tests. Mason and Tobias waited in the cabin, expecting arrest at any moment. Instead, 12 hours later, Sarah arrived. "You did it," she said, exhausted but smiling. "The Inspector General's office has launched a full investigation. Congress is demanding hearings. The program's been suspended pending review." "What about us?" Mason asked. "Am I going to prison?" "That's the interesting part. Officially, you don't exist right now. No charges have been filed, because filing charges would mean acknowledging what you exposed. You're in legal limbo." A week later, a different kind of visitor arrived at the cabin. Emily Reeves, no longer in military attire but in civilian clothes that somehow made her look more dangerous. "Congratulations," she said, her tone neutral. "You've set back American electromagnetic defense research by a decade." "I exposed illegal weapons testing," Mason countered. "You exposed a program that would have guaranteed American military superiority for the next century. Do you think China isn't working on the same technology? Russia? They're probably thanking you right now." "Then maybe the solution is transparency, treaties, international oversight." Emily laughed. "You really are naive. But it doesn't matter now. The program's been shut down. The facility's being dismantled. Officially, it was all a failed renewable energy experiment, classified due to the proprietary technology involved. That's the cover story. It's a good one. Explains the secrecy, the military involvement, even the electromagnetic effects. The solar storm that night caused equipment malfunctions leading to false readings. No weapons, no conspiracy, just government incompetence and corporate greed. But we have the video. Deepfake technology is amazing these days, isn't it? Already experts are questioning the authenticity of your footage. In 6 months, it'll be dismissed as an elaborate hoax. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. You won. The program's dead. But you also lost, because now we're behind in a race you don't even know is being run. When the next Carrington event happens, and it will, and when someone else's electromagnetic weapons are the only things working afterward, remember that you had a chance to keep America ahead. After she left, Mason and Tobias sat in silence. "Did we do the right thing?" Tobias finally asked. "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but we did the only thing we could live with." Act 6. The Aftermath. 6 months later, Mason stood on a hillside in Montana, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. He'd bought a small ranch with the money from selling his story to a documentary filmmaker, though the documentary was marketed as speculative fiction based on true events, the only way to avoid lawsuits. The official story had held. Aurora Station was dismantled, its existence explained away as a failed green energy project that had wasted millions in taxpayer dollars. A few congressional hearings happened, Some bureaucrats were reassigned, and the whole thing faded from the news cycle within weeks. But Mason knew the truth hadn't died. It had just gone deeper. His phone buzzed. A new model, heavily encrypted, provided by a whistleblower organisation that had taken interest in his case. The message was from Johnson, the Canadian agent, using their agreed-upon code. Northern fishing trip was successful, caught several large ones. Weather patterns remain interesting. Translation: Canadian intelligence had secured evidence from Aurora Station and was monitoring similar activities elsewhere. Mason's laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Sarah Park, now a civilian after her forced retirement. She worked for an oversight organisation monitoring defence contractors, a watchdog with teeth, funded by tech billionaires worried about military overreach. 3 new renewable energy projects have been proposed, one in Norway, one in Tasmania, one in Patagonia, all in areas with high auroral or electromagnetic activity, all with the same contractor connections we documented. They're not stopping, just spreading out the research to avoid another concentrated target. Mason typed back, "Keep watching, we'll be ready." Tobias had moved to Montana too, setting up his radio equipment in a barn on Mason's property. He spent his nights monitoring the same frequencies, listening for the telltale pulses that would indicate resumed testing. "You know they're going to try again," Tobias said one evening as they watched the aurora together. "Different place, different cover story, but the same goal." "I know," Mason replied, "but now there are more of us watching. The network Sarah's building, Johnson's contacts, the scientists who've quietly left the program. We changed something." "What?" "The technology's still out there. We changed the conversation. Before, it was a complete black box. Unlimited funding, zero oversight, no questions asked. Now, even if they restart, they know people are watching. They have to be more careful, more limited. And sometimes that's all you can hope for, not to stop something completely, but to slow it down enough that safeguards can catch up." A year after the Aurora Station revelation, Mason received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man, Russian accent thick despite decades in America, introduced himself as Victor Petrov. "I designed the original device," he said simply. "Cosmos 2341. I defected in 1990, told the Americans everything about the satellite, but they didn't believe me about its full capabilities until it crashed and they recovered it. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 30 years watching them try to weaponize my creation. I designed it as a shield, protection against solar storms, a way to strengthen the magnetosphere. They turned it into a sword." Victor handed Mason a worn notebook, filled with equations and diagrams. "The counter-frequency," Victor explained. "Every electromagnetic weapon has an opposite wave that cancels it out. If they start testing again and broadcast this frequency, it will neutralize the pulse, make their weapon useless. Why didn't you release this yourself? Who would believe an old Russian about American weapons? But you've already proven the truth once. You have credibility I never had." Mason studied the notebook. This could prevent them from ever developing the weapon, or force them to find a different approach, hopefully a less dangerous one. Technology always advances, Mason. The question is whether wisdom advances with it. 3 years passed. The Aurora Directive became a footnote in conspiracy forums, dismissed by mainstream media, but kept alive by a dedicated community of researchers. Mason continued flying cargo. Now for a small company he had started himself, serving remote communities across the Northwest. He kept his ears open, his contacts active, always watching for signs of renewed activity. Then, on a routine flight to Whitehorse, his instruments went haywire in a familiar pattern. He checked his coordinates, nowhere near any known facility. But below, barely visible through the snow, he glimpsed something that made his heart race. Vehicle tracks leading to a low mound in the terrain, communication towers that shouldn't exist, and the distinctive shimmer of camouflage netting. They'd started again. Different location, probably different country, but the same program. That night Mason activated the network. Within hours, journalists in 5 countries had the coordinates. Satellite imagery was purchased and analysed. Environmental groups dispatched teams to monitor wildlife. Sarah's organisation filed Freedom of Information requests with 17 different agencies. But this time, Mason also did something different. Using Tobias's radio equipment and Victor's notebook, he broadcast the counter-frequency directly at the site during their next test window. The results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of generating a controlled pulse, the facility experienced what witnesses described as the Northern Lights descending to Earth. A massive, uncontrolled electromagnetic discharge that destroyed every piece of electronic equipment within 5 miles, but, crucially, harmed no one. The facility was abandoned within a week. Emily Reeves made one last visit, finding Mason at his ranch. "That was you," she said. "It wasn't a question. The counter-frequency. You've made the entire concept obsolete." "Good." "You don't understand what you've done. That technology was our best shot at defending against solar storms, against electromagnetic attacks from other nations." "Then develop it openly," Mason interrupted, "with international cooperation, civilian oversight and safety protocols. Stop turning every discovery into a weapon." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that's possible?" "I believe it's necessary. The Aurora belongs to everyone, Emily. The moment you tried to weaponize it, you guaranteed someone would stop you." She left without another word. 2 months later, Mason read about a new international initiative, the Global Electromagnetic Defense Coalition, a joint effort between 12 nations to study and protect against solar storms and electromagnetic phenomena. The project would be based in Antarctica, with full transparency and civilian oversight. Emily was listed as the technical director. Epilogue. 5 years after Aurora Station, Mason stood in a classroom at the University of Alaska, guest lecturing for a course on environmental science and ethics. The professor had introduced him as a cargo pilot, with an interesting perspective on Arctic development. "The Arctic has always been a mirror," Mason told the students. "What we do there, hidden in the ice and isolation, reflects who we really are as a society. We can use it as a laboratory for weapons, or we can use it as a classroom for cooperation." A student raised her hand. "Is it true what they say online? That you exposed a secret weapon program?" Mason smiled. "I exposed what happened when good people convinced themselves that secrecy was more important than accountability. Whether it was weapons or whether research doesn't matter as much as the lesson. Power without oversight corrupts, whether that power is political, military or electromagnetic." After the lecture, Mason drove to a hillside overlooking Fairbanks. The Aurora was particularly active that night, sheets of green and gold rippling across the sky. His phone buzzed, a message from Tobias. "All quiet on the frequencies, looks like a peaceful night." Mason typed back, "For now, but we keep listening." As he watched the Aurora dance, natural, untamed, unweaponized, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a cargo pilot just trying to make a living, stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and somehow emerged as an unlikely guardian of one of nature's most magnificent phenomena. The Aurora Directive was dead, but Mason knew the impulse behind it. The desire to control, to weaponize, to dominate would never fully die. There would always be those who looked at the beauty of the Northern Lights and saw only potential military advantage. But now there were also those who watched the watchers, who questioned the questioners, who demanded that some things remain beyond the reach of classification stamps and black budgets. His phone rang. Sarah Park. "Mason, you'll want to see this. New contract just went out for a bid. Something called the Thermosphere Research Initiative. Guess where it's being built?" "Where?" "Greenland. And guess who's listed as a technical consultant?" Mason didn't need to guess. The game was starting again, just with new players and new rules. "Send me everything," he said, "and contact Johnson. Tell him the fishing trip might need to head further north." As he drove back to his ranch, the Aurora continued its eternal dance above, beautiful and dangerous, natural and mysterious. Mason had won one battle, But the war between transparency and secrecy, between weapons and wonder, would continue as long as humans looked up at the lights and dreamed of harnessing heaven. But that was okay. Mason had learned something important in his fight against the Aurora Directive. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but forcing them to play by better rules. The weapons researchers would continue their work, but now they did it knowing that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always ready to broadcast the counter-frequency that would turn their weapons into nothing more than an expensive light show. The Aurora belonged to everyone, and Mason Fry, cargo pilot turned reluctant guardian, would make sure it stayed that way. As he pulled up to his ranch, his radio crackled to life. Tobias's voice, excited. "Mason, you need to hear this. I'm picking up something new. Not pulses this time. It sounds almost like music." Mason smiled grimly and headed for the barn where Tobias kept his equipment. The work was never done, the mysteries never ended, and somewhere in the static between stations, in the frequencies that bounced off the ionosphere, new secrets were waiting to be discovered and, if necessary, exposed. The Aurora danced on, keeper of secrets, canvas for humanity's ambitions, and reminder that some forces of nature should remain forever wild. Snow-cold silence. The Karen Red case. Thanks to Kristin for this incredible story idea. Now let's begin tonight's breakdown. The night was ending, but for some, it would never truly be over. Picture a quiet Massachusetts suburb blanketed in fresh snow. The kind of snow that muffles sound, that makes the world feel suspended in time. In those early morning hours of January 29th, 2022, a Lexus SUV backed out of a residential driveway at 7 minutes past 5 in the morning. The camera captured it all in grainy detail. Inside that vehicle sat Karen Reed, a financial analyst whose life was about to become a national obsession. What she didn't know as those tyres crunched over ice was that her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe, lay dying in the snow just miles away. And what none of them knew was that this death would unravel into one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern Massachusetts history, splitting a community down the middle and raising questions that still echo through courtrooms and living rooms across America. This is not just a story about a death in the snow. This is a story about what happens when the people sworn to find the truth might be the ones hiding it. The night, everything changed. January 28th, 2022 started like many winter weekends in the Boston area. Karen Red and John O'Keefe had been dating for over 2 years. He was a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, a father figure to his niece and nephew after his sister's death, a man known for his dedication to family and his work. Karen was successful in her own right, established in her career, respected by colleagues. They were the kind of couple that seemed solid, the kind neighbours would describe as nice people, without a second thought. Around 9 that evening, they arrived at the Waterfall Bar and Grill in Canton, Massachusetts. It was a typical night out, drinks with friends, laughter cutting through the winter chill that had settled over the region. Security cameras captured them entering together. Witnesses later recalled seeing them at the bar, nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the tragedy waiting in the hours ahead. The evening wore on, drinks were poured, conversations flowed, and eventually, as it always does, the night began winding down. After midnight, they left the bar. This is where the story everyone thought they knew begins to fracture into competing narratives, each one claiming truth, each one pointing fingers in different directions. According to the prosecution's version of events, Karen and John drove to 34 Fairview Road, the home of Brian Albert, a former Boston police officer who had retired from the force. It was supposed to be an after-party, a chance to continue the night's festivities in a more private setting. But somewhere in the confusion of that snowy night, something went terribly wrong. At 7 minutes past 5 on the morning of January 29th, surveillance footage captured Karen's Lexus SUV backing out of the garage at John's residence in Canton. The timestamp would become crucial, dissected frame by frame in the investigation to come. Shortly after that footage was recorded, John O'Keefe was found lying in the snow outside 34 Fairview Road. He was unresponsive, his body already succumbing to the brutal Massachusetts winter. Emergency responders arrived to find a man face down in the snow, his clothing soaked through, his body temperature dangerously low. They rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was done. At 59 minutes past 7 that morning, John O'Keefe was pronounced dead. The cause, according to the initial medical examination, was blunt force trauma to the head combined with hypothermia. A police officer, a father figure, a boyfriend, gone in the span of a few frozen hours. The question everyone immediately asked was simple. What happened? The answer, it turned out, was anything but simple. The investigation begins. When a police officer dies under mysterious circumstances, the investigation typically moves with precision and urgency. Fellow officers rally to find answers, to bring closure to the family, to ensure that justice is served. This case would follow that pattern, but with twists that no one could have predicted. Within days, investigators had begun piecing together what they believed was a clear narrative. They focused on Karen Reed. Her vehicle had a cracked tail light. Fragments of red and clear plastic, consistent with automotive taillight material, were found at the scene where John's body was discovered. Karen had been drinking that night, and her blood alcohol level, recorded later that morning, was elevated. To the initial investigators, it seemed straightforward. A tragic accident caused by impaired driving. Karen had struck John with her vehicle, either while dropping him off or during some kind of altercation, and then fled the scene in panic or confusion. On February 2nd, just 4 days after John's death, Karen Reed was arrested. The charges were severe: manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death. Each charge carried significant prison time. The district attorney's office presented their case to the public with confidence. They had physical evidence, they had motive in the form of relationship troubles, and they had witnesses who would testify to seeing the aftermath. But even as the prosecution built their case, cracks were beginning to show. Questions emerged that didn't have easy answers. Witnesses offered contradictory statements. Evidence that should have been clear-cut became murky under scrutiny. And Karen Reed, through her attorneys, began to tell a very different story. The defence didn't just argue that Karen was innocent of accidentally striking John with her vehicle. They argued something far more explosive, that John O'Keefe never died, outside 34 Fairview Road. They claimed he died inside the house, the victim of an assault by people who were supposed to be his friends, his colleagues in law enforcement. And they argued that those same people, desperate to cover up their involvement, had framed Karen Reed for a crime she didn't commit. It was a conspiracy theory in the truest sense. And like all conspiracy theories that gain traction, it was built on a foundation of suspicious coincidences, unanswered questions, and a deep distrust of the official narrative. The theory that changed everything. In April 2023, more than a year after John's death, Karen Reed's defence team went public with their alternative theory in a dramatic fashion. They released affidavits, held press conferences, and launched what they called the Canton Cover-Up campaign. The name itself was designed to provoke, to suggest that this wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or faulty investigation, but an active conspiracy involving multiple law enforcement officers working together to frame an innocent woman. The defence's theory was elaborate but internally consistent. They argued that on that night in January 2022, John O'Keefe did go to 34 Fairview Road, but he went inside the house. Once there, according to this theory, he was involved in some kind of altercation. Perhaps it was an argument that escalated. Perhaps it was a physical confrontation that went too far. The specifics were unclear, but the result, the defence claimed, was that John was severely injured inside that home. Faced with a dying or dead police officer in their house, the occupants panicked. These weren't random civilians. They were current and former law enforcement, people who understood exactly how serious the situation was, people who knew how investigations worked, people who had the connections and knowledge to potentially manipulate the system. So instead of calling for help, instead of telling the truth, they made a different choice. They carried John's body outside, placed him in the snow, and began constructing an alternative narrative that would shift blame onto Karen Read. It sounds almost too calculated to be believable. But the defence had evidence to support their claims, and some of it was genuinely disturbing. The most striking piece of evidence was a Google search conducted on a phone associated with the Albert household. At 27 minutes past 2 in the morning on January 29th, hours before John's body was officially discovered, someone searched for the phrase, "How long to die in cold?" The timestamp was crucial. If John was already outside at that time, dying in the snow, why would someone inside the house be searching for information about how long hypothermia takes to kill? The defence argued this search was made by someone who knew John was outside, someone who was watching the clock, someone who needed to know how long to wait before discovering the body. Then there was the tail light. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the cracked tail light of Karen's Lexus as proof that she had struck John with her vehicle. But the defence brought in experts who examined photographs of the tail light taken at different times during the investigation. These experts testified that the damage pattern didn't match what would be expected from striking a person. More concerning, they claimed the photographs showed the tail light had been damaged further between initial evidence photos and later examination, suggesting someone had tampered with the evidence to make it appear more consistent with the prosecution's theory. Witness statements also began to unravel under scrutiny. Multiple people who were at 34 Fairview Road that night gave statements to police. But their accounts didn't align. Some said they never saw John arrive. Others said they were asleep and didn't know he'd been there at all. But phone records and other evidence suggested more activity in the house during the crucial hours than these witnesses were admitting. Why would people lie about whether they saw John unless they had something to hide? The investigation of the investigators. As the defence's theory gained public attention, scrutiny fell on the people conducting the investigation. And what emerged from that scrutiny was deeply troubling, regardless of which version of events you believed. The lead investigator on the case was Massachusetts State Police Trooper Michael Proctor. On the surface, he seemed like a competent officer with years of experience. But as the case progressed, text messages from Proctor's phone were uncovered and released to the defence as part of discovery. What those texts revealed was shocking. Proctor had sent numerous messages to friends and fellow officers about Karen Read, and they were vicious. He mocked her appearance, made crude sexual comments, and expressed frustration with the case. In one particularly damaging exchange, he wrote about the difficulties in proving the prosecution's theory. "We won't be able to prove she hit him with her car. All the powers that be want answers ASEEP. Zero chance she skates." Read that again. The lead investigator, early in the investigation, was already expressing doubt about whether they could prove their own theory, while simultaneously stating that pressure from superiors meant Karen couldn't be allowed to avoid charges. That's not how justice is supposed to work. Investigations are meant to follow the evidence wherever it leads, not to start with a conclusion and work backward to justify it. The texts got worse. Proctor discussed wanting to use his badge to gain access to Karen's private medical records. He joked about inappropriate searches of her personal information. The pattern was clear. This wasn't an objective investigation. This was a personal crusade. On March 19, 2025, Michael Proctor was fired from the Massachusetts State Police. The official reason was the derogatory texts about Karen Read and alleged mishandling of evidence. By that point, the damage to the prosecution's case was irreversible in the court of public opinion, even if the legal proceedings continued. But Proctor wasn't the only investigator whose conduct raised questions. The defence pointed out numerous unusual aspects of the evidence collection and preservation. Karen's vehicle was towed to a police facility, but instead of being secured in a locked bay as would be standard for such crucial evidence, It was left in an area accessible to multiple officers. Her cell phone from the night of the incident was taken by investigators, but then mysteriously went missing for a period of time before being found again. Chain of custody documentation, which should meticulously track evidence from collection to courtroom, had gaps and inconsistencies. Perhaps most troubling were the connections between the investigators and the potential suspects in the defence's alternative theory. Brian Albert, the owner of 34 Fairview Road, was a former Boston police officer. His brother was an active officer. His wife's sister, Jennifer McCabe, was also at the house that night, and her phone was the one associated with the How Long to Die in Cold search. Another guest at the house was Brian Higgins, an agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. These weren't random civilians. These were people embedded in the law enforcement community, people with relationships and connections to the very officers investigating the case. In a normal investigation, those connections would be disclosed and managed to prevent conflicts of interest. Officers with personal relationships to potential witnesses or suspects would recuse themselves. Independent oversight would be brought in. None of that happened here, at least not initially. Instead, the investigation proceeded with investigators who had professional and personal ties to the very people the defense was accusing of murder and conspiracy. The federal investigation. As the case gained national attention and the allegations of misconduct piled up, federal authorities took notice. In early 2025, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division launched an investigation into the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office and the handling of the Karen Read case. For those who believed in the Canton cover-up theory, this federal investigation was vindication. Finally, they thought, an outside agency with no local connections would uncover the truth. The corruption would be exposed, the real killers would be brought to justice, and Karen Read would be exonerated. But in March 2025, the federal investigation closed without bringing any charges. No indictments were issued against Brian Albert, Jennifer McCabe, Brian Higgins, or anyone else accused in the defence's theory. No charges were brought against Michael Proctor or other investigators for evidence tampering or conspiracy. The investigation simply ended, with federal authorities offering little public explanation for their decision. For the prosecution, this was proof that the conspiracy theory was exactly that. A theory unsupported by evidence robust enough to bring charges. They argued that federal investigators had reviewed all the same evidence the defense pointed to and concluded it didn't support criminal charges against anyone except Karen Read herself. For the defense and their supporters, the closure of the federal investigation without charges only deepened their conviction that the cover-up extended further than they had imagined. They argued that law enforcement agencies protect their own, that the blue wall of silence extended from local police departments to federal agencies. The lack of charges, in their view, wasn't evidence of innocence, but evidence of how deep the corruption ran. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere more complicated than either narrative suggests. Federal investigations close without charges for many reasons. Sometimes it's because no crimes occurred. Sometimes it's because proving a crime beyond a reasonable doubt is impossible, even if investigators suspect wrongdoing. Sometimes it's because the crimes, if they occurred, fall outside federal jurisdiction or don't meet the specific criteria for federal charges. We may never know exactly why the federal investigation closed without action, but its closure didn't end the debate. If anything, it intensified it. The trials. The legal process in the Karen Read case was as dramatic and contentious as the investigation that preceded it. The first trial began on April 16th, 2024, more than 2 years after John O'Keefe's death. The prosecution presented their case: the cracked taillight, the plastic fragments, Karen's elevated blood alcohol level, and testimony from witnesses who described her as distraught and making incriminating statements in the hours after John's body was found. The defense countered with their conspiracy theory. now refined and supported by expert testimony. They brought in accident reconstruction specialists who testified that the injuries to John's body were inconsistent with being struck by a vehicle. They presented the Google search evidence, the text messages from Michael Proctor, and testimony about the connections between investigators and the Albert household. They argued that reasonable doubt wasn't just present in this case, it was overwhelming. For weeks, the jury heard testimony. They saw photographs of John's body, of the crime scene, of Karen's vehicle. They listened to expert witnesses from both sides contradict each other on crucial points. They heard Karen's own voice in recordings from that morning, heard her distress, heard her confusion. On July 1st, 2024, after days of deliberation, the jury announced they were hopelessly deadlocked. They couldn't reach a unanimous verdict on any of the charges. The judge declared a mistrial. Karen Read would not be convicted, but she would not be exonerated either. Instead, she would face a second trial. The retrial began on April 1st, 2025. By this point, the case had become a media sensation. Supporters of Karen Read gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs proclaiming her innocence and demanding justice for what they saw as a law enforcement conspiracy. The trial was live-streamed, with thousands watching the proceedings in real time and dissecting every moment on social media. This time, the jury reached a verdict. On the most serious charges, second-degree murder and manslaughter, they found Karen Read not guilty. They also acquitted her of leaving the scene of an accident. But on one charge, operating a vehicle under the influence of alcohol, they found her guilty. The judge sentenced her to 1 year of probation. The split verdict satisfied no one completely. The prosecution argued it proved Karen was impaired and operating her vehicle recklessly that night, even if the jury couldn't conclude she had deliberately or accidentally killed John O'Keefe. The defence and Karen's supporters argued the not guilty verdicts on the most serious charges vindicated their theory that she had been framed, and the single guilty verdict was a compromise by jurors who felt pressure to convict on something after such a lengthy and expensive trial. Karen Read walked out of the courthouse on probation, legally neither fully guilty nor fully innocent in the death of the man she loved. The unanswered questions. Even after 2 trials, after thousands of hours of investigation, after millions of words written and spoken about this case, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Did John O'Keefe ever go inside 34 Fairview Road that night? There is no surveillance footage from inside the house showing his arrival. Every person who was in that house that night claims they did not personally see him enter. Yet the defence argues he must have been inside based on his injuries and the circumstances of his death. Without video evidence or a witness willing to break ranks and tell a different story, this question remains open. What caused John's injuries? The medical examiner who performed the autopsy concluded his injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle and exposure to the cold. But defence experts examined the same body, the same photographs, the same medical data, and concluded his injuries were consistent with a beating, including wounds they argued came from a dog attack based on the pattern of marks on his arm. 2 sets of experts, 2 completely different conclusions. Both can't be right, but how is a jury, or the public, supposed to determine which experts to believe? When exactly did John die? The timeline is crucial to both theories. The prosecution needs him to have been struck by Karen's vehicle and left outside to die in the early morning hours. The defence needs him to have been alive inside the house long enough for the conspiracy to unfold and for that Google search about hypothermia timing to make sense. Phone records show John's phone locked and stopped recording activity at a specific time, but does that mean he died then? Or just that his phone died or was damaged? Who made that Google search? The search for how long to die in cold came from a phone associated with Jennifer McCabe, who was at the Albert House that night. When questioned about it, she denied making the search and suggested it must have been a mistake or an artifact of some technical glitch. Forensic analysts confirmed the search was real and occurred at the timestamp indicated. So who made it? and why? Was evidence tampered with? The defence presented testimony suggesting Karen's taillight was damaged further during the investigation to make it more consistent with the prosecution's theory. They pointed to inconsistencies in photographs taken at different times. The prosecution argued any apparent differences were due to lighting, camera angles, or the natural process of collecting and examining fragile evidence. Without a video recording of every moment the vehicle was in custody, proving tampering definitively is nearly impossible, but the suggestion alone cast doubt on the evidence's reliability. Why did Michael Proctor send those texts? Even people who believe in Karen's guilt struggle to defend Proctor's conduct. His messages were inappropriate by any standard, and his admission that they struggled to prove their own theory, while feeling pressure to secure a conviction, is deeply troubling. Was he just a crude, unprofessional investigator who nonetheless pursued a legitimate case, or were his texts evidence of a predetermined conclusion he was trying to justify after the fact? The broader context. The Karen Red case didn't happen in a vacuum. As the case gained national attention, investigative journalists began examining the broader context of law enforcement in Norfolk County and the Canton area. What they found added fuel to the fire of conspiracy theories. In 2021, a woman named Sandra Birchmore died in Canton. The official ruling was suicide, but her family and advocates raised questions about that conclusion. Sandra had been involved with police officers from the Stoughton Police Department, and there were allegations of inappropriate relationships and potential abuse. When her death was initially investigated, some of the same networks of law enforcement officers that would later be connected to the Karen Read case were involved in that investigation as well. The parallels were impossible to ignore for those inclined to see a pattern. Here was another suspicious death in the same county, another investigation involving interconnected law enforcement, personnel, another family left with unanswered questions and suspicions of a cover-up. The Birchmore case eventually led to federal charges against one of the officers involved, Matthew Farwell, but only after years of advocacy by Sandra's family and outside journalists. The fact that it took so long for action to be taken, and that local investigators had initially closed the case, seemed to validate concerns about how law enforcement handled investigations of their own. These connections matter because they shape how people view the Karen Read case. If this were an isolated incident, if there were no other examples of questionable investigations or suspicious deaths in the area, it would be easier to dismiss the conspiracy theory as paranoid fantasy. But when you can point to other cases, other examples of investigations that seem flawed or compromised, the conspiracy theory becomes more plausible. Pattern recognition is a powerful cognitive tool, even when the patterns might be coincidental. The public divide. Perhaps no aspect of the Karen Red case is more striking than how it has split public opinion. This isn't a case where most people believe one narrative with a small minority dissenting. Instead, it's a case where large numbers of passionate, informed people have reached completely opposite conclusions about what happened. On one side are those who believe Karen Read is a victim of a massive law enforcement conspiracy. They attend her court hearings, they organise rallies and fundraisers, they maintain social media accounts dedicated to exposing what they call the Canton cover-up. They see the suspicious Google search, the biased investigator, the connections between officers and witnesses, and they conclude that the only logical explanation is that John O'Keefe was killed inside 34 Fairview Road, and Karen was framed. For them, her conviction on the impaired driving charge is a miscarriage of justice, a compromise verdict by a jury that couldn't bring itself to fully acquit her, despite the overwhelming evidence of reasonable doubt. On the other side are those who believe the prosecution's core theory. They see a tragic case of drunk driving, a woman who made a terrible mistake and then compounded it by refusing to take responsibility. They look at the physical evidence, the cracked tail light, the plastic fragments at the scene, and they see a straightforward explanation. For them, the conspiracy theory is a desperate defense strategy, A Hail Mary attempt to create reasonable doubt by throwing out wild accusations. They point to the federal investigation's closure without charges as proof that outside investigators found no merit to the cover-up claims. They argue that Karen's acquittal on murder charges doesn't prove she's innocent, just that the prosecution couldn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a high bar in any case. Between these two camps are people who genuinely aren't sure what to believe. They see troubling elements on both sides. They think Karen might have been involved in John's death, while also believing the investigation was compromised and potentially corrupt. They can imagine scenarios where John went inside the house, but then came back outside where Karen accidentally struck him. They wonder if the truth is some combination of both narratives that neither side is willing to acknowledge. This divide isn't just about the facts of the case, it's about deeper questions of trust. Do you trust law enforcement to investigate itself? Do you believe officers will tell the truth even when it implicates their colleagues and friends? Do you think the justice system works? Or do you think it's rigged in favour of those with power and connections? For many people, the Karen Red case became a referendum on those questions, rather than just a determination of what happened on one snowy night in January. If you already distrusted police, if you already believed the system was corrupt, then the Canton cover-up theory made perfect sense. If you believed in the integrity of law enforcement and the justice system, then Karen's conviction, even the limited one, seemed appropriate. The aftermath. As of now, the legal proceedings continue in different forms. A civil wrongful death lawsuit was filed on August 23, 2024, by John O'Keefe's family against Karen Reed and 2 Canton bars that served alcohol that night. The lawsuit is currently stayed pending appeals, but it represents another legal front in a case that seems to have no end point. Karen Red herself remains a controversial figure. To her supporters, she's a folk hero, a whistleblower who exposed corruption at the highest levels of Massachusetts law enforcement. They've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for her defence, attended every court hearing, and vowed to continue fighting for what they call justice. To her critics, she's a killer who got away with murder through a clever legal strategy and public manipulation. They see her supporters as gullible, taken in by conspiracy theories and anti-police sentiment. The people at 34 Fairview Road that night have largely retreated from public view. Brian Albert sold the house and moved away. Jennifer McCabe has faced harassment and death threats from Karen Red supporters who believe she's part of the conspiracy. Brian Higgins has maintained his silence throughout. These are people who, regardless of what happened that night, have had their lives completely upended by their connection to this case. John O'Keefe's family remains caught in the middle. They lost a beloved son, brother and uncle in a tragic death. They want answers, they want justice, but the competing narratives have made it nearly impossible to get either. Some family members have publicly supported the prosecution's case and expressed anger at what they see as Karen's efforts to defame John and deflect blame. Others have remained quiet, perhaps unsure what to believe or simply exhausted by the years of legal battles. The truth in the snow, so what really happened on that night in January 2022? After all the trials, all the evidence, all the testimony, can we say with certainty? The honest answer is no, not with complete certainty. That's the frustrating reality of many criminal cases. The truth exists somewhere in the past, but our ability to reconstruct it is imperfect. We have fragments, security footage, phone records, text messages, physical evidence, witness statements. We try to assemble those fragments into a coherent picture, but the fragments don't always fit together neatly, and different people can arrange them into very different pictures. What we can say is this: John O'Keefe died in the snow outside 34 Fairview Road in the early morning hours of January 29, 2022. His death was tragic and preventable. Whether Karen Red caused his death through impaired driving, whether people inside that house caused his death through violence, or whether the truth involves some combination of factors we haven't fully understood, John deserved better than to die alone in the cold. We can also say that the investigation into his death was deeply flawed. Even if you believe the prosecution's theory, even if you think Karen Redd is guilty, the conduct of lead investigator Michael Proctor was inexcusable. His biased texts, his expression of doubt about the case combined with determination to secure a conviction, his admitted mishandling of evidence, all of that compromised the investigation. A case this serious deserved better. John's family deserved better. Karen Read, whether guilty or innocent, deserved an investigation conducted with integrity. We can say that the connections between investigators and potential witnesses raised legitimate questions about conflicts of interest and whether the investigation was truly independent. In any case, but especially one involving law enforcement officers and their families, extra care should be taken to ensure investigators have no personal stakes in the outcome. That didn't happen here, and the failure to maintain proper boundaries opened the door for conspiracy theories that might have been easily dismissed if the investigation had been handled properly from the start. We can say that the justice system, for all its flaws, worked to some degree. Karen Read had her day in court, actually multiple days across 2 trials. She had competent legal representation, evidence was examined, witnesses were cross-examined, and juries made their determinations. The fact that the verdicts didn't fully satisfy anyone doesn't mean the system failed. Sometimes justice is messy and incomplete, because the truth itself is messy and incomplete. What we can't say is exactly what happened in those crucial hours. We can't say with certainty whether Karen struck John with her vehicle, or whether he was assaulted inside the house. We can't prove who made that Google search or why. We can't definitively state whether evidence was tampered with, or whether apparent inconsistencies have innocent explanations. These uncertainties will likely never be fully resolved, and people will continue to debate them for years to come. The Watchman. Question. The closing question posed in the outline is perhaps the most important one. When law enforcement investigates itself, who watches the Watchman? This is not a new question. It's been asked throughout history whenever those in power are accused of misconduct. The answer has always been complicated and unsatisfying. We want to believe in oversight mechanisms, in internal affairs divisions, in civilian review boards, in federal investigations. We want to believe that bad actors will be caught and punished, that the system will self-correct. But the Karen Read case exposes the weaknesses in those mechanisms. Michael Proctor conducted a biased investigation for more than a year before his texts were discovered. The connections between investigators and the Albert household weren't flagged early and addressed. The federal investigation closed without charges despite what many saw as clear evidence of at least misconduct, if not criminal conspiracy. At every level, the oversight that should have caught problems either failed or never materialized. This doesn't necessarily mean there was a massive conspiracy. Oversight mechanisms fail for many reasons. Sometimes it's incompetence rather than corruption. Sometimes it's institutional culture that discourages questioning fellow officers. Sometimes it's just the difficulty of investigating complex cases with limited resources and imperfect information. But the failure of oversight, whatever its cause, has consequences. It erodes public trust. It makes people more susceptible to conspiracy theories. It makes every future case more difficult because witnesses and jurors and the public bring their suspicions and doubts with them. The Karen Redd case should prompt serious conversations about how law enforcement investigations are conducted, especially when the investigators have personal or professional connections to the people involved. It should lead to reforms in how evidence is collected, preserved and tracked. It should result in clearer protocols for identifying and managing conflicts of interest. It should spark discussions about independent oversight and accountability. Whether those conversations will happen, whether those reforms will be implemented, remains to be seen. History suggests that real change is difficult and rare. But if John O'Keefe's death can lead to improvements that prevent future miscarriages of justice, whether those future cases involve wrongful convictions or failures to convict the guilty, then something meaningful will have come from this tragedy. The snow remembers. Snow has a quality of preservation. It covers, It conceals, but it also freezes moments in time. When spring comes and the snow melts, what was hidden is revealed. The Karen Red case is like that snow. It covered over questions and contradictions, at least initially. The first narrative, the simple story of a drunk driving accident, seemed to wrap everything up neatly, to freeze the story in a comprehensible form. But as time passed, as the snow metaphorically melted under scrutiny, what was revealed was far more complex and troubling. The simple story gave way to competing narratives, to unanswered questions, to suggestions of conspiracy and corruption. Some of what was revealed might be truth, some might be paranoia, and some might be something in between. What we're left with is not closure, but continued uncertainty. Karen Read is not in prison for murder, but she is not fully exonerated either. John O'Keefe's death is officially resolved in the legal system, but the questions about what really happened remain open in the court of public opinion. The people accused in the conspiracy theory have not been charged, but their names are permanently associated with these allegations. Perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest outcome. Perhaps it reflects the reality that in some cases we simply cannot know the complete truth with certainty. We can have suspicions, we can have beliefs, we can even have legal verdicts, but absolute certainty eludes us. What we can do is learn from the failures exposed by this case. We can demand better investigations, better oversight, better accountability. We can ask harder questions when law enforcement investigates its own. We can be skeptical of both official narratives and conspiracy theories, recognizing that the truth is often more complicated than either extreme suggests. And we can remember John O'Keefe not just as a figure in a controversial case, but as a person. A 16-year veteran officer who dedicated his life to public service. An uncle who stepped up to raise his sister's children when she could no longer care for them. A man who, whatever the circumstances of his death, deserved better than to die alone in the snow, while those who might have helped him either couldn't or wouldn't. The snow that fell on January 29th, 2022 has long since melted. The seasons have changed, the years have passed, but the questions raised that night remain, frozen in the public consciousness, waiting for answers that may never fully come. That's the real tragedy of the Karen Red case. Not just that a man died, though that is tragic enough, but that we may never know with certainty why he died, who is responsible, or whether justice was truly served. When the next snow falls in Canton, Massachusetts, some people will think of that night. They'll think of John O'Keefe, of Karen Read, of 34 Fairview Road. They'll think of the questions that still hang in the air like snowflakes that never quite settle to the ground. And they'll wonder, as we all wonder, whether the truth is buried somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered, or whether it melted away that morning and can never be recovered. The silence of that snow-covered night keeps its secret still, and in that silence we hear the echo of every unanswered question, every unresolved doubt, every failure of the system we trust to deliver justice. The case of Karen Read and the death of John O'Keefe is closed in the legal sense, but in every other way that matters, it remains open, a wound that has not healed, a mystery that has not been solved, a story that has not yet found its ending. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps some stories don't get neat endings. Perhaps the only certainty is the snow falling and melting, covering and revealing freezing moments in time, but never quite preserving them completely. And perhaps that's the most honest conclusion we can reach, that we know what happened that night only in fragments, in pieces, in competing versions that can never be fully reconciled. The snow remembers, but it doesn't tell, and so we're left with our questions, our theories, our suspicions and our doubts. We're left with a case that became a symbol, a trial that became a cultural moment, a death that became a debate about trust and truth and justice in America. We're left with the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the system we rely on to find answers fails to deliver them. and we're left with the memory of a man who died in the snow, and the woman accused of killing him, and the shadow of doubt that hangs over everything that came after. That shadow is the legacy of this case, not resolution, but uncertainty, not closure, but continued questions, not justice clearly served, but justice debated and disputed and doubted. In the end, that might be the most troubling outcome of all, because if we can't trust the system to find the truth, in a case this scrutinised, this examined, this thoroughly investigated, then when can we trust it? And if we can't answer that question, then the shadow grows longer, the doubt spreads wider, and the next case becomes that much harder to resolve. The snow-cold silence that gave this case its name isn't just about the quiet of that winter night. It's about the silence of unanswered questions, the silence of evidence that doesn't speak clearly, the silence of witnesses who won't or can't tell the complete truth, the silence of investigators who failed in their duty, the silence of a system that couldn't deliver the certainty we expect from justice. And in that silence, John O'Keefe rests, his truth known only to himself and perhaps to those who were there that night. The rest of us are left to wonder, to debate, to take sides in a controversy that may never be fully resolved. That's the real story of the Karen Read case, not a story with a beginning, middle and clear end, but a story that continues to unfold, to evolve, to challenge our assumptions about truth and justice and the institutions we trust to deliver both. The documentary ends, but the case does not. The questions remain, the silence persists, and somewhere in that silence, buried beneath layers of evidence and testimony and competing narratives, lies the truth. Whether we'll ever uncover it completely is a question that only time, and perhaps new evidence or confessions, can answer. Until then, we're left with what we have, an unsettling case that exposed the fault lines in our justice system and left us all wondering whether we can truly know what happened when those sworn to protect us are the ones under suspicion. The snow has melted, the truth remains frozen,